follow this transmission from the social networks. We remind you that we are transmitting and simultaneous interpreting in Spanish and English, and we invite you to follow us with the tag No More Policy State. Welcome to the reading of the decision of the Permanent People's Tribunal. To get started with this event, I want to give the floor to Alberto Yepes. He is the coordinator of the Human Rights Observatory and for International Humanitarian Law of the Colombia, Europe, and United States Corporation. He will give us some context on what the People's Tribunal has been. Good morning to all who are listening, the honorable members of the Permanent People's Tribunal, the victims and organizations that presented their cases. The Permanent People's Tribunal arrives in Colombia with its ruling at times when the frustration for unkept promises of a long-promised peace have been expressed with revelry in the streets, with fair outrage that has maintained the Colombian people demanding the state to comply with its obligations to Colombian people. The frustrations with this peace process that has failed to meet its promises of land for the peasants or agricultural reform for the dispossessed, of alternatives of development for hundreds of thousands of families that live off illicit crops, of the promises of truth, justice, and reparation for 9 million victims of the conflict, has been expressed, rightly so, by the citizens to demand the state to meet its obligations to the peace accords and its obligations with respect to the commitments to several social sectors. Over 30 years of failure to keep their commitments have thwarted these processes. The tribunal has seen how the peace processes with the ELN, with the Quintín Lame groups, and previous processes with other organizations were breached, were violated, because it's been a tradition. The Colombian state, the perpetration of crimes against peace, the treason of the agreements, the betrayal of the agreements, and the failure to comply with what is agreed upon. These peace accords have sought for several decades to put forth efforts to overcome the genocide that has been suffered by the Colombian people, a genocide that starts from the conquest times. Historians mention how when this Spanish arrived in the South America region, over 100 million indigenous people were here. And after the genocide, after the extermination, there were only over 3 million people in these lands. Independence didn't stop extermination against the people, and otherwise it consolidated the dispossession of land in the hand of the new rulers. The century starts with multiple genocides, such as the massacre of the working people, which was presented in this People's Tribunal, that claimed for the possibilities of working and being able to sew the uniforms for the public forces. And the response was genocide. The Bananeras massacre, the massacre against the Gaitanista movement that organized to fight the instances of power. All the peace processes that they try to start from the 80s have culminated with betrayal against this process, and the armed conflict has served as cover for a constant extermination process against the people. Over 1,180 social leaders have been killed since the signature of the peace accords in 2016. 386 of the former combatants that surrendered arms, signed peace, and trusted the Colombian state to meet its promises have also been killed. The promise of an agricultural reform never made progress in the accords. The promise of political participation has been breached by the state's position of hindering the seats in Congress for the victims, denying sustenance for thousands of families that live off illicit crops has been replaced by forced eradication, a new stage of the war against drugs, where aerial spraying is once again victimizing the peasants. Despite the efforts of the Truth Commission to clarify these crimes perpetrated within the framework of the conflict, the truth is that the law enforcement and the state have failed to provide information that would allow to unveil the thousands of crimes that have been committed against the population in many years of armed conflict. Not one single page of intelligence report counterinsurgency strategies and violations of human rights, despite the fact that the Truth Commission has been flooded with hundreds of reports wherein it would seem that the only victims of the armed conflict are the members of the public forces. Despite the efforts of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace to take some of these perpetrators of state crimes to justice, the truth is that most of the responsibles have not appeared before justice, and the few of them that have appeared have denied the truth and have denied their responsibility. For all these things, in April 2020, around 400 organizations and personalities of the Colombian people, human rights defenders, women leaders of all conditions, we formulated to the Permanent People's Tribunal a request to, for the third time, take care of the genocide against the Colombian people, the permanent genocide that has been perpetrated, the crimes against peace, and the impunity that we remain under. In November, the Permanent People's Tribunal communicated to us that by January the 26th, we would have the sessions. Today, we're here to hear the decision after having heard 54 cases of genocide from over 14 social sectors that presented these genocides in over 100 years of genocide against the Colombian people, with the slogan, "People is rising for the people." We seek to gather several social sectors that would want to express the lack of justice, the fact that in this country, there are no possibilities for those that are run over, that in this country, after hundreds of persons that have been injured and killed in this strike, justice is no use. The ombudsman's office is only defending the powerful to guarantee positions and contracts for the governing party. The Attorney General's office is only investigating popular leaders and mayors and congresspersons who are on the side of the people. Given this lack of justice, what we've seen on the streets is that with the coming of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is seen as if the Pope was coming in or a rock star was coming in. This shows the complete absence of justice in these days, the complete absence of operation of the entities that should be trying to clarify the atrocities, and the hope of the Colombian people in the international justice, particularly in this Permanent People's Tribunal that has very, very respected persons from their moral value, for their high commitment to justice, and that dispossess their commitment to justice and the peoples who are suffering from oppression and genocide. So we hope that the Permanent People's Tribunal, through this ruling, can shed light to continue helping with the fights of the Colombian people, so that those who have the obligation of clarifying these atrocities do their job and help us put a stop to this genocide and put a stop to these crimes against peace, against impunity, and to allow the Colombian people someday to be able to create the conditions to overcome, through a negotiated path, the armed conflicts that genocide and extermination against the Colombian people are concealed under, that the crimes against peace be judged, that the persons responsible for this be taken to justice, and so that national and international instances and the Colombian justice and the organizations can see in this decision a established goal to be able to overcome this dark night of violence and genocide that has been suffered by the Colombian people for so many years. Thank you very much. Thank you, Alberto, for such an important context that you're giving us about this journey of the Permanent People's Tribunal until 2021 in our country. And now we give the floor to Simona Fraudatari. She's a member of the Permanent People's Tribunal, and we welcome the members and the president of the jury to open this panel.
Gracias a todos los organizadores, a los que están haciendo posible que se tenga esta lectura del fallo en un contexto tan difícil como el que se está viviendo en este momento en Colombia. Con esta breve introducción del Secretariado General del TPP, vamos a abrir oficialmente el espacio de lectura de la sentencia del Tribunal Permanente de los Pueblos sobre genocidio político, impunidad y los crímenes contra la paz en Colombia, que corresponde a la sesión número 48 del TPP y a la tercera realizada en este país. Las 3 sesiones del TPP sobre Colombia se realizaron en momentos muy diferentes de la historia del país. La primera fue parte de un largo proceso
The first was part of a long process started in 1998 and ended in 1991 with the issue of impunity and crimes against humanity in Latin America. This session took place in a context of political transformation in the content, transformations that weren't able to eradicate practices that had grave violations of human rights, and they were instead covered by regimens of formal democracy and laws on impunity. So in this context, the tribunal highlighted a true culture of impunity and the insistence and persistence of violence and institutional and extra-institutional violence. The second session, carried out between 2006 and 2008, had a special social economic context where we were able to see the existing ties between the massive presence of transnational companies that belong to different productive and extractive sectors on the one hand, and on the other, an intensification of the human rights situation and situation of the peoples, which were violated generally and systematically, with major consequences in relation to the economic and social structures, which were already unjust in themselves, as well as the impossibility to access justice in relation to the human rights violations that were carried out, or the complicity of the transnational companies. The entity presented before the TPP with a request on April 1st, 2020 from a wide variety of social organizations, collectives, communities, and personalities, not only in relation to the more recent violations, which were widely denounced and documented in the post-accord sector, but also, as Alberto Yepes mentioned, the violations that took place in over almost a century. And this, for the tribunal, has been translated into the construction of the country's history to be able to understand the continuity of human rights violations and violations of the peoples, which require identification of its deep-seated roots, the methods, reasons, and the intentions behind these violations, why they have occurred, and why they continue to occur. So the request, as was mentioned, led to the opening of a session which had its first moment on January 22nd of 2021, with the official delivery to the PPT and with the accusation presented by Angela Maria Bituero and Ivan Velasquez. And so the hearings that were held on March 25th, 26th, and 27th, 2021, with a jury that was made up of 13 different personalities from Latin America, Europe, including Bishop Raul Vera, Andres Barreda from Mexico, Loti Cunningham from Nicaragua, Esperanza Martinez from Ecuador, Graciela Deleo and Daniel Feinstein from Argentina, Luis Moita from Portugal, Antonio Bigram Solde from Spain, Mariela Fanon, Michael Forst, and Felipe Texier from France, and others. And so this tribunal heard the evidence presented by different population groups in relation to the different thematic and cross-cutting issues. It's worth noting that regardless of the notification and invitation that was sent to the Colombian authorities so that they would be able to defend themselves, no one appeared before this tribunal which listened to the official defense that was presented in the public hearing. There was also the provision of extensive and detailed oral evidence, including analysis and reports from the affected groups, a context analysis on a national and international level, and specific studies about the mechanisms and methods of repression over time. The judges of the tribunal have worked intensely to evaluate and rate the different evidences that were received, and in line with the national and international standards for the protection of human rights, this ruling takes into account that the additional documentation produced by the Colombian institution, as well as the jurisprudence carried out by the Inter-American Human Rights Courts, the most relevant reports from international entities, and finally, the two documents that led to, which are the Universal Declaration of People's Rights and Statute 1979, which was updated in 2018. The ruling has 5 major chapters with recommendations. The evidence presented has been reconstructed in detail in the chapter dedicated to the incidents and facts, which tells the history, the reconstruction of the history and the geopolitical context, by means of which the tribunal argues and demonstrates the concept of ongoing violence. These 2 chapters are accompanied by others that are dedicated to the national and international legal framework and the elements of the peace agreements that were highlighted during the public hearing. Today, there will be a reading of some of the most significant elements that were presented in this ruling, and which refer to the different facts, context, and the legal framework of the ruling and its recommendations. It's not possible to read the full text due to its extension, as it is over 200 pages long between the ruling and its annexes. The social realities that led to the intervention of the TPP are very aware that its rulings are not binding. The People's Permanent Tribunal, PPT, is not a criminal tribunal. Instead, it's characterized as an international tribunal of opinion. This is a space to increase visibility, to a space for words, and to construct new knowledge to reduce the distance between an abstract understanding of rights and the realization and of the different collective and individual rights. Each section of the tribunal in Colombia has resulted in a historic need, and the different entities have led to the presentation of new needs and new valorations in relation to the transformation of rights. And this is seen as a tool to transform the reality and bring it closer to a complete understanding of justice, which includes the common aspiration for peace, democracy, and a political and an economic model that allows for human dignity. Thank you for this brief introduction. And now we'll move on to the reading of the ruling. And we will have Graciela Daleo and Loti, who will continue with this space. Thank you.
Muchas gracias. Buenos días al
Thank you.
pueblo colombiano.
Thank you, and hello to the Colombian people. The summary of the facts that were presented in the hearing on March 25th, 26th, and 27th, as well as the detailed documentation that was annexed to back the ruling in relation to the ongoing genocide in Colombia. First, indigenous peoples. Here we see a point in the initial period being the conquest and colonization from Spain, and it continues today through massacres, enforced disappearances, murders, and the stealing of lands, forced displacement, the imposition of cultural standards that go against their survival and impede their spiritual practice, as well as impacting the environment. Their stigmatization and understanding as internal enemy is combined with ethnic and political ideological discrimination, where we see an underline of the interests of national and multinational companies that are installed or have the idea of going into the territories of indigenous peoples. According to ONIC, 39 of the 102 existing peoples in Colombia are currently face the risk of physical and cultural extinction. The Bari people has been uprooted from more than 90% of its ancestral territory, which was massively handed over to extractive companies and agro-industrial companies. This policy is combined with the actions, the repressive actions for more than decades that is constantly attacking the Bari people. And as their spokesperson said, what happened to us in this time was that we were massacred. The Imberachami people documented an intensification of the post-colonial harassment starting in the 80s, and that in 1985, many of the members were first disappeared, and then they were found dead with signs of torture. The selected murders of their leaders and traditional authorities continue. At the beginning of the 21st century, the paramilitaries, with the support of the state security forces, they multiplied the enforced disappearance and massacres. These incidents were denounced before the ICHR and national authorities, who ordered measures that were not that did not stop the genocidal practices. The National Organization, Indigenous Organization of Colombia, ONIC, which was created in the 80s with the principles of unity, land, culture, and autonomy, to respond to the governmental policies of massacres, torture, disappearances, and murders of leaders and indigenous authorities. Between November 2016 and August of 2020, the legal and illegal forces have carried out 70,314 attacks, which include confinement, enforced displacement, murder, threats, and attacks. In the first 10 months of 2019, 115 indigenous leaders were murdered. Second, the Black and Afro-descendant peoples. This chain continues, this chain of racial violence and crimes against humanity that were denounced and led to the destruction of their collective being and life project as a people. It has started with the kidnapping and forced transfer of millions of Africans towards America. This path of ethnocide, ethnic cleaning, genocide has continued to date. The state has punished with a repression of the Archimedes and different projects. In 2001, there were 4 massacres, 34 murders, and 36 disappearances, as well as the forced displacement of 3,000 individuals. In 2008, 12.3% of the population of the Black and Afro-descendant population had been a victim of enforced displacement. And in 2013, the 50% were massive displacement. The murders, tortures, violations, rapes, sexual attacks, threats, and dissimulated murders that were said to be false positives, as well as the recruitment of young people from the Black people, provoked collective damage to their identity. And many were put into prison. And many faced administrative charges. The National Agrarian Coordinator. 3, peasants. One of the areas where the peasants have noted that they are a target of state violence is in relation to land use and land ownership, which from the beginning of the Colombian state has looked to respond to the interests of the local bourgeois and transnational companies. All the presentations and denouncing the actions of legal and paramilitary forces against the campesino communities follow the military manuals, where they are called internal enemies and collaborators or members of the guerrillas. Anuk UR, from the beginning of the 80s, has been the target of different attacks, forced detentions of its leaders, of peasants who have been uprooted from its land, as well as the destruction of crops. They denounced innumerable massacres, many of which were perpetrated in areas where the community organization was opposing the interests of companies. In the Rochella massacre in 1989, 15 judicial employees were killed. These are individuals who are investigating the massacres and their perpetrators in the area. Regardless of the ruling from the ICHR, the massacres continue. The peace community of San Jose de Apartó, in the same moment when it was created in 1997, it faced overhead bombings and military occupation. The violence continued with the murder of children and massacres, media attacks, stigmatization, judicial persecution, and as well as being facing blockades and military occupation, which forced people from the community to abandon their lands. In 2019, there was an announcement of 86 attacks against the community. Municipality of Cajaviya in Cauca, with the aim of destroying the peasant organization, which was very active in 1999, we see that there was massacres understood to be the path of death in November of 2000, where paramilitary commanders moved through the air. Receptor y Chamacé and Casanare. Between 2002 and 2003, state forces and paramilitary forces carried out counterinsurgency operations that were carried out against that led to the hundreds of enforced disappearances, torture, executions, and the forced displacement of about 3,000 individuals. The community was essentially exterminated alongside the implementation of oil activities from state and private companies. Carmen and San Vicente de Chucurí, the repressive practice of the state forces and paramilitaries were supported by business people and landowners with the aim of displacing and uprooting and assassinating the peasants from their lands, as well as wiping out the community action councils and other communities. Between 1991 and 1993, about 300 people were murdered and 30% of the population was displaced. Many of them were forced into exile or asylum. The Eastern Central region, criminal prosecution was the practice that was the focus of this denouncement. You see the censuses, the scanning of documents of the individuals preceded the detention of social leaders and other. In November 2002 in Cerevena, thousands of people were enclosed, and in 2002, more than 2,000 individuals were jailed, and 10,000 have suffered administrative detentions. The National Coordinator of Agrarian Issues denounced that in their territories where they have a presence, they have been suffering the destruction of their grassroots organizations, territorial control, criminalization, and prosecution of its members, as well as the uprooting from their lands. We see this happened with the Association of the Small and Medium Scale Agricultural Workers of Tolima, which was said to be a military target of the AUC, which led to their disintegration. A similar situation took place in the Eastern Plains, where we have the implementation of Plan Colombia, Plan Patriot, and the consolidation as of 2006 of a plan which led to the 5 cemeteries where the no names with the Macarena, Villavicencio, Villahermosa, Granada, and San Jose del Guaviare. And of the more than 2,300 bodies that were buried as not identified, 1,664 were reported by the military as people who were killed in combat. Putumayo and the Peasant Reserve Zone of the Perla Amazonica. The presence of the army to guarantee oil interests, the appearance of coca crops, and paramilitaries opened up a period of assassination, torture, massacre, and forced disappearance. The forced displacement of more than 50,000 families and the use of glyphosate, which affected the crops, benefiting the companies. Sur de Bolívar. We see the confinement and biological actions that was carried out by repressive forces against the population using bombings, and political, social, and economic blockades. Villarrica, between March and June of 1995, it suffered the overhead bombings using napalm, which caused the death of the inhabitants. as well as fires and the contamination of the flora and fauna.
Graciela, no tienes audio.
Graciela, we can't hear you. Your audio's not working.
La violencia ejercida contra los sindicatos y sus integrantes apunta contra la especificidad de sus objetivos, concepciones y prácticas. Las masacres de las bananeras dan inicio a una práctica continuada de represión que ha diezmado y hasta exterminado a dirigentes, activistas, afiliados y a las propias organizaciones. Se denunció la vinculación entre las fuerzas
There was a link between state forces and companies and against the interest of the workers. Military manuals include them as internal enemy. Over 3,000 people were killed between 1986 and 2019. Over 150 victims of forced disappearance between 1986 and 2017. Hundreds of people suffered threats and attempts. Colombia was first for years in a list of union leaders that were killed. The National Union Workers Syndicate faced the violence from Nestlé and Coca-Cola. It continues to today. The killings and forced disappearances, judicial processes, tortures, and also attacks against the unions and attacks against their legal entities. Unión Sindical Obrera groups oil sector workers that have suffered constant repression. From the 80s to the present, they registered 125 killings, 24 kidnappings, 7 forced disappearances, 49 attempts, 102 arbitrary detentions. I'm sorry, she's reading so fast and it's impossible to keep up for translation. I will do my best. The restructuring was accompanied by a company that pointed to people as part of the armed insurgents. There were reports of over 8,000 events against the members that include killing of relatives. Between 1986 and 2018, of the over 3,000 union leaders that were killed, over 2,000 were members of the CUT. There has been no year without killings and persecution against their members. Political movements. All the denouncements reveal that any political movement that expresses any kind of dissidence is immediately tagged. Audio is very poor and it's very hard to keep up. We saw the killing of the leader Gaitán in 48 and afterwards many of his sympathizers, and this continues with the memory side and the stigmatization that seek to eliminate his heritage. The Colombian Communist Party denounces several events of violence against its members, human rights defenders, students, educators, massacres, homicides of different regional leaders, forced disappearances, attacks against their facilities, extrajudicial executions, verbal wars, judicial and every time there were any electoral or partisan coalitions, they were target of this violence. Among, in this case, she's done over 3,000 homicides, over 500 forced disappearances, 1,600 displacements, and stigmatization of the members. The attacks were targeted against elected officials and against the grassroots. I'm sorry, I've lost the audio from the speaker. The FARC has participated in instances of negotiation to achieve negotiated ends to the conflict and resolution of the causes that gave rise to it. And the Colombian state has failed to comply with its commitments. Until February this year, 272 former combatants have been killed and have suffered attempts against their lives, 17 forced disappearances, threats, and individual and collective displacement. Former combatant women suffered the stigmatization to rob them of their character. Most of the victims were union leaders. The M19 participated in the peace negotiations, while in parallel, the army continued to kill its members. The murder, disappearance, and forced exile was not limited to its members, but also some popular members of the people were suffering these attacks. The state's slogan was unhindered war, and the corpses were thrown into clandestine pits. Many people were killed. And in 1998, its legal status was canceled. The paramilitary group Rastrojos From the beginning, they were subject to attempts, homicides, killings, and disappearances, forced disappearances within and outside the country. In the forming communities with presences of this front, the paramilitaries perpetrated many attempts. In 1972, it gained positions in many different fronts of government.
Contra líderes y lideresas sociales. Entre 1994 y 2019 fueron 1.815 las víctimas de homicidios y o desapariciones forzadas. 710 fueron asesinadas entre 2017
700 of them were killed between 2017 and 2019, and 3,010 were killed in 2020. Until June 2020, elections occurred in 29 of the 32 departments. Violence was targeted at defenders of community rights, of collective territories of the peasantry, and the voluntary substitution of crops, of illicit crops, and political rights and democratic participation. Those who exercise the legal defense of the human rights, of LGBTI rights, rights of children and adolescents, and the defense on environmental defenders. Also, journalists are targeted to the repressive actions. Women defenders of human rights face additional barriers because of gender stereotypes. In 2020, 51 defenders of human rights have been victims of homicides, attempts, and attacks and threats. 7 university student movement. The university community is considered part of the internal enemy. The Universidad Industrial de Santander denounced that between 1964 and 2006, 24 students were killed. Between 1980 and 2003, at least 10 suffered forced disappearance. At the moment of presentation before this tribunal, there were 57 people killed, 437 criminal actions against their members. Universidad de Antioquia, until 2018, 86 of its members were killed. 46 of them were students. 42 of them were victims of forced disappearance. 30 of them were students. In 1981, 121 students were subjected to verbal aggression, and 6 of them were convicted. 8, situation in prisons. Hundreds of people are in prisons and punishments and isolation cells, and the their mistreatment is commonplace. They're usually locked in maximum security prisons, subjected to verbal aggression and physical aggression. They have also been victims of forced disappearance and even killed in jail. Between 2002 and 2019, at least 249 social leaders, environmental defenders, and human rights defenders have been imprisoned. 9, exile. Forced displacement, transborder forced displacement denounced as part of the state systematic violence. The UNHCR's figures have grown. In the 90s, they talked about 2,000. In 2006, they talked about 72,000. And in 2007, during the second term of President Uribe, there were over 500,000. At the end of the peace accords, hundreds of Colombians started returning to their country. With the worsening of the paramilitary state's violence, they caused a new wave. In 2020, the indigenous peoples, Black peoples, Afro-descendants, and farming communities denounced the impacts on nature that has also been victim of the armed conflict and transformation imposed by the productive models that are extractivist. Large-scale exploitation of natural resources that cause irreversible damage to the territory, potentialized by the use of glyphosate, the contamination of water sources. This crime is called ecocide. Thank you, Lottie Cunningham and Graciela D'Aleo, for your effort of summarizing a large amount of information that is included in the events chapter. Talking about the 7 population groups and 3 cross-cutting axes. I will now hand the floor to Andrés Barrera, who will explain the essential elements of the context in Colombia, and with the recommendation of please speaking at a slow pace so that the interpreters can possibly try to interpret into English. Thank you.
Good morning. The historical and political context of Colombia. The permanent violence of Colombia at the beginning responds to historical and material conditions that were established in the historic construction process of a new regional identity that comes from the challenges that are imposed by having to orient unilaterally in this region of the world mining and extractive activities that are destroying and permanently ignoring the meaning capacities of all the pre-Hispanic populations. So if the Spanish conquest opens up the demographic collapse that began in the 16th century, mining and extractive has perpetuated a lack that has been artificially produced. And from there, we see the growing dependence on the population coming from both Africa as well as successive groups of Spanish and European people. But also, from there, we see the huge challenge not only to recolonize, but also to integrate and maintain the unilateral control of vast and dispersed territories. Without the presence of these extractive activities that are continuously clashing with the demographic precariousness, it would be impossible to explain the will of the Colombian people to govern from a feudal structure using structural use of violence. This violence that, regardless of the ongoing modernization of the oligarchies, which started in the 16th century, there was never a real true awareness, and it never ended. And instead, it was exasperating, turning the people of Colombia into a group that was always watching the counter-reform experiences and the counter-revolutionary actions and counter-historic actions. The slow growth of the population has inevitably led to the possibility of expanding the civilized borders, or the borders of the nation state, which leads to the occupation and conquesting of new regions. But each new region that is taken over becomes new population groups that continue and are perceived by the dominating class as more difficult to control in more and more remote and distant regions. And that's why there's the repeated violence and growing violence as an essential way to coordinate in a vertical manner all social relationships. And it is that is how it is unfortunately defined, this violent economic, political, cultural, and social violence of the Colombian oligarchy. But while this Colombian oligarchy becomes independent of Spain and continues to act with an ongoing war between conservatives and liberals, the United States, on the other hand, with its own expansionist vision and geostrategic interests of the region in the Caribbean, using Cuba and the Antilles Islands, the new Spain, which included Mexico and Central America and the Grand Colombia, that these are the three key regions in the bio-oceanic and planetary control. And so after taking Panama from Colombia between 1905 and 1914, the United States looked at what was happening, not only the subversion of the Colombian oligarchy, but also with the geopolitical availability of its mission, that this group of power and how it could be used by the empire. So we see a new horizon of geopolitical domination through US violence, which was carried out over Colombia, which allows it to feel like a specific and special state. Specifically when Jorge Eliezer Gaitán was murdered and the popular uprising is drowned in blood, this all coincides with the creation of the CIA and the implementation of the School of the Americas in Panama, which would not take long to involve the Colombian oligarchy within its logic of the Cold War. First, inviting the military forces of Colombia to participate in the Korean War, and then very quickly using the Colombian military forces, the maybe pampered army of the northern forces, where the United States defines Colombia. I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you. I have some technical challenges with the transmission in Spanish. It looks like they're trying to maybe sabotage the space or the reading of the ruling. We have more than 400 people in who are live. So can we just pause for a couple minutes? We're okay on the timeline, but we're having these challenges, and we don't want to lose your message while we resolve this technical challenge. It looks like they're trying to sabotage the event. That's fine, don't worry, we can wait with patience.
Ya me indican que estamos a unos minuticos muy corticos de retomar, entonces ya en un momento nos
We'll
dan.
be starting again in just a few minutes. I'll let you know in just a minute when we can start again.
En breve nos van a dar entonces el paso para continuar.
And very briefly, they'll be giving us the green light to continue. And since we understand why this kind of challenges or attacks take place, so while we'll wait patiently, as Professor Andrés said, I also want to send my greetings to the other individuals who are with us, the jury and the other participants who are here with us in this space today to read the ruling. And so very briefly, we'll be able to continue. And Professor Andrés, I'm just going to take a minute to explain what has happened, and then you can continue reading your text.
Listo. Tito, ¿me confirmas? Ya podemos entrar otra vez.
Okay, we're going to be able to continue.
Continuamos entonces con esta
So we will be continuing with the reading of the international ruling from the People's Permanent Tribunal. We are with Professor Andrés, but before he continues, we'd like to mention that we have had some technical challenges. We don't know the origin of these challenges in the transmission. And we have more than 400 people who are connected in a simultaneous manner listening to this international ruling. So now we will continue with Professor Andrés. Thank you so much. So I'm going to go back to the paragraph I was reading when we cut the communications. So we were explaining how in the 40s, there was a new horizon of geopolitical domination. This is a violent domination from the United States on Colombia that allows it to feel that it gains strength after the assassination of Gaitán, when the popular uprising was drowned after his murder. And this coincides with the creation in Panama, Americas, and
se comienza a escalar, década tras década, la naturaleza y los niveles de la violencia que ejerce la oligarquía colombiana y su Estado en contra del pueblo de Colombia. Y es a partir de esta complicidad
it's based on this complicity that essentially begins what today we recognize as this ongoing genocide. The convergence between the oligarchical domination and the imperial domination, it isn't just related to the military coordination, but it's precisely here where we see that the violent or oligarchical tradition of Colombia is mutated into a peasant paramilitary structure, which is geo and politically supported directly by the Pentagon, that looks to stop the growth of the other armed groups. And so while these expressions of rebellion growth, they become more and more sophisticated. There's a sophistication also of the different kinds of aid. And now it's not just military aid, but it's also paramilitary aid. The insufficiency of the paramilitary structure to contain the uprising of the 60s and the 70s leads to, during the 80s, to be transferring the Anglo-Saxon tradition and the control of criminal structures and drug trafficking as a second tool of the social war against the people of Colombia. The US's win in Vietnam allows for a transfer of the worst control mechanisms that are progressively established in the territory against the political and physical life in Colombia. Through different governmental administrations, and they have allowed and interwoven this terror and repression between the oligarchy, the state, and successive paramilitary groups and drug cartels that have invaded in seven waves of horrific violence against the people of Colombia. So with numerous phenomena, maybe the chemically most pure example of this convergence between the oligarchy and the most decadent manipulation of the empire is seen through Álvaro Uribe Vélez. His electoral victory and ongoing popularity must be carefully examined, not just as a triumph, as a historic triumph of the fundamentalism of the large landowners of the Cold War and the national security doctrine, as well as the narratives of the welfare state and free trade. But it's actually something worse than all of that, because the majority of the Colombian citizens, they know that prosperity, this national prosperity and well-being for the last 4 decades is closely tied to the importation and consumption of cocaine in the United States. The voters for Uribe see favorably the intervention of Plan Colombia, as well as the extreme violence and extermination actions that this president has applied to discipline the uncomfortable Colombian uprising. Thanks to the popularity and the opportunistic military support from the United States, we see a rapid increase in the actions, military actions against the guerrillas, where Uribe uses a policy of horror that is legitimized in the media, using the AUC paramilitaries until its climax, where it is the dissimulation is simulated. We see that there's a general disorganization of the left, which is in parallel and leads to the extermination of all kinds of social leaders, rural communities, trade unions, students, indigenous, Afro-Colombian, peasant communities, through the mass dispossession to recover land for large landowners, land that for the last 5 decades had been out of their control. So amid this efficacy, the case of the false positives leads to the paradox within the army, where it grants monetary incentives to exterminate the population, where we see that now the young people are exterminated in a planned, systematic, and massive way. But there's no ideological, religious, racial, or political pretext, but it's just with the motivation of the administrative or neoliberal policies of economic interests. We see this horrific actions, the genocidal actions of the neoliberal model in Colombia. Essentially, at the end of his mandate, Uribe validates the arrival of 8 US bases throughout the Colombian territory. According to preliminary numbers from the National Center for Historic Memory, Álvaro Uribe between 2002 and 2010 can be shown to be the direct responsible party for 24,000
En el caso de la relación con la tierra, que afecta a los procesos de persecución del movimiento campesino, o con el trabajo, que afecta a los procesos de persecución del movimiento sindical. Ello sin dejar de reconocer las profundas y complejas interrelaciones entre estos actores y grupos, que le otorga a todo el proceso un carácter político innegable, pero que solo puede comprenderse en sus modos de articulación como un intento de largo aliento, de destrucción y reorganización parcial del Grupo Nacional Colombiano. De allí la caracterización del proceso como continuado o de larga duración. El segundo inciso analiza el intento de destrucción parcial del Grupo Nacional Colombiano. Voy a leer también una breve síntesis. Este intento de destrucción parcial del Grupo Nacional Colombiano debe ser analizado en la búsqueda de su subsunción en el tipo penal, a la luz tanto de la legislación y la jurisprudencia internacionales como del propio estatuto del Tribunal Permanente de los Pueblos. Todas herramientas que habilitan la figura de destrucción parcial del Grupo Nacional como parte inescindible de la definición de genocidio. Para el caso de las conductas y hechos que se están incriminando en este escrito, y luego del análisis pormenorizado de los mismos, queda claro que el elemento discriminatorio que claramente se aplica en la definición y tipificación del grupo es el de grupo nacional. Las modalidades de genocidio que definen y tipifican las conductas y hechos incriminados aquí se concretan así: actos perpetrados con la intención de destruir parcialmente a un grupo nacional mediante matanzas de miembros del grupo, lesiones graves a la integridad física y mental de los miembros del grupo y sometimiento intencional del grupo a condiciones de existencia que llevan a acarrear su destrucción física parcial. La identidad nacional puede buscarse entonces en el orden jurídico al que se acogen los asociados en nación, en cuanto a expresión de unos ideales, objetivos e inspiraciones comunes que motivan a vivir en común, y por otra parte en los modos específicos en los que dicha vida en común se desarrolla, algo en lo que concuerda esta visión jurídica y política con el análisis sociológico. A medida que han aparecido políticas contrainsurgentes por parte del aparato de Estado de Colombia, se ha creado simultáneamente la convicción acerca de la existencia de facciones dentro de la nación colombiana. Esta postulación de facciones, reales o hipotéticas, efectivas o afectivas, fundadas o infundadas, en torno a un ideal nacional o a una idea de nación, es la que ha reconstruido a la nacionalidad colombiana como una entidad escindida en diversos grupos nacionales en conflicto, constituyendo a determinados grupos de la población o a determinadas prácticas sociales como alienadas de la colombianidad, asignándoles una calificación de extranjería a grupos nacidos y desarrollados en el propio territorio y a sus prácticas, en algunos casos centenarias, de construcción de lazos sociales. De dicho modo, se ha planteado una escisión entre los que serían las formas aceptables de vivir y actuar la nacionalidad colombiana y otras formas que, fuera que tuvieran historias de siglos o de décadas en el territorio, fueron conceptualizadas como contrarias al espíritu nacional colombiano y a partir de ello perseguidas y o aniquiladas como parte de una supuesta defensa de la nación contra estos enemigos de la misma. El elemento discriminatorio nacional, eje de la estructura de las acciones y de la lógica de su intencionalidad, identifica personas o poblaciones enteras como constituyentes de un ideal nacional en conflicto con el ideal nacional de los perpetradores. Sin embargo, estas diferencias se encuentran fundamentalmente.
However, these differences are fundamentally within the minds of the active genocidal subject. That is, the imaginary construction of incompatible and conflicting national ideas does not require a correspondence with reality, which may have an objective existence in some cases, but just a mere imagination and proposal of its existence has sufficient capacity to produce and activate the genocidal intent from the construction, whether real or imaginary, in the interpretation of the perpetrators. It is this representation of a nation in danger that guides the total destruction or partial destruction of these groups that are allegedly endangering the nation. The counterinsurgent strategy of the Colombian State for many decades has incorporated the genocidal target of its national subgroups as the total or partial destruction of population groups that are aligned, whether actually or hypothetically, against the practical model of nation with which the law enforcement agents identify, and as well as the most powerful layers and institutions of the social Colombian conglomerate. The access to knowledge of this counterinsurgent strategy can happen through two complementary paths. First, through repeated declarations from members of the high military hierarchy that have been configuring a counterinsurgent doctrine, and second, through the study of the counterinsurgents manuals of the armed forces of the state of Colombia that give access to the practical guide or operational or actual operation of counterinsurgents. Through these two paths, you can discover the mindset of civilians or the understanding of civilian population as the main target of the counterinsurgent action of the state, under the assumption that for the insurgent, it is the same function of water with fish, that of being the vital medium. This simile of taking water away from the fish, which is the most valued target of the counterinsurgent strategy, has been translated for several decades into actions of extermination and persecution, massacres, assassinations, forced disappearances, tortures, acts of terrorism, bombings, forced transfers, of course, resettlements, destruction of housing and crops, violations or rape, a rigorous control of family and social life, denial of the rights to intimacy, displacement around the territory, freedom of conscience, opinion, communication, and expression, denial of the right to demand and to protest, subjection to forms of brainwashing through propaganda techniques that have been carefully designed in the manuals, and subjection of the populations to the terrifying presence of paramilitary groups, a clandestine arm of the army that are covered under certain anonymity and a civilian or out or extra legal nature to be able to perpetrate the most horrendous crimes, evading controls and sanctions. In the case of Colombia, what we can observe is a conflict that went through, that traversed all the community social bonds, but whose representation tends to be reduced to the effects of an armed conflict or to the fight against drug trafficking, making invisible the consequences of terror in the transformation of the social fabric and the effects and in any possibility of reparation or in the experience of annihilation. To understand annihilation of the destruction of one part of us is the only way of trying to restore the absence, reinstate what was thought to be destroyed, questioning the imposition of the identity of the oppressor, which constitutes the strategic objective of perpetrators. In this case under analysis, it is not equivalent to represent or to qualify the Colombian case as a confrontation between armed organizations with excesses towards the civilian population, rather than conceiving the whole of state and of state violence as a systematic attempt to partially destroy the national Colombian identity that sought through the action of the forces of the state and para-state bands, criminal groups, or mercenaries even, to disrupt and to transform the social relationships in the Colombian society, eliminating through terror full modes of perception of identity, forms of militancy, structures, organizations, traditions, dreams, projects of thousands and thousands of Colombians that who were tore away from the possible destinations of their community. The third subsection analyzes the impact of different subgroups within a general process. They analyze the different impacts of each of the subgroups. The fourth subsection analyzes the intent of destruction and the forms of defining the enemy based on the documentation produced by the different organizations. The fifth subsection analyzes the importance of recognition as genocide within the Colombian case under the right to truth and reparation of the victims. And I will read a fragment of the last subsection 6.1.6, which talks about the forms of representation. If the objective of a genocidal process is the disruption of a people's identity, it not only occurs after the practices of persecution and annihilation, but it is realized, that is, it is materialized in the modalities through which said people tells the story of what has happened to it. In this case, a pattern of persecution, destruction, and annihilation of groups that has been protracted in Colombian society for over 70 years. Genocide gains its symbolic realization or materialization when a people is no longer able to tell the story that it has lived, but it fragments it and it conceptualizes it in forms that won't allow it to recover the identity that the material moment of genocide had come to destroy. One of the most clear examples has been analyzed in the testimony before this tribunal of Gloria Gaitan, who has highlighted the alienating effect in Colombian history of referring to la violencia, the violence, to account for this, for the beginning of this process. This expression, la violencia, constitutes a clear desubjectivization of the period, a way of eliminating the traces, both of the persons responsible for said violence, the armed forces, law enforcement, paramilitary groups, and rulers of the times, of the many different groups that suffered it, many of whom have tried to reconstruct their history in their presentations before this tribunal, and their identity and the forms of causality that allows to understand it, the disruption of the social fabric and the partial destruction of the identity of the Colombian people as a result of the systematic exercise of violence against several groups of the population. This structure of alienation of the forms of explanation and understanding of the violence that can be seen at this beginning have been repeated once and again throughout the period analyzed, with abstract formulations that seek to hinder the registration, the recording, the reinstatement of the processes of identity destruction, whether with expressions such as la violencia or with the reference to certain wars, the war against insurgents, the war against drugs, or with referral to certain events or the idea of an armed conflict, as it has happened since the beginning of the peace conversations until the present. It is thus that the violence, the war, or the armed conflict constitute expressions that would seem to explain the actions from a confrontation that is naturalized, that is conceived as part of an unmodifiable reality, that would seem to homogenize, to make homogeneous a violent behavior within the group of social fabric and social relations in Colombia, and which simultaneously conceals the types of modified social relations, conceals the victims of said transformations, and conceals those who have benefited from the destruction of this social fabric. It is thus that it constitutes a fundamental objective of any justice process to call things by their name, to not be an accomplice in the way that the things are named and using euphemisms to name things, and to really account for the social fabric and the social bonds that have been destroyed by what constitutes a continued genocide process in Colombia, a practice that sought to affect a group of social actors, and that therefore allows us to be able to identify the persons responsible and the persons who benefited from this process of destruction.
Gracias, Daniel. Ahora le doy la palabra a Tony Pigrao.
Thank you, Daniel. I'm opening up the space for Tony Pijao. We can't hear you. Can you open your microphone? Good morning, everyone. So I'm going to continue with the chapter of the legal presentation, and I'm going to refer to points 2 and 3 of this chapter. In the second section, we talk about the concepts of war and crimes against humanity. As Daniel did, I'm going to read some of the sections from these chapters. During the hearings, it was shown that there were numerous concrete crimes that are understanding different crimes against humanity and war crimes, seen the extent of the crimes and the diversity of victims, and throughout the Colombian territory where these crimes have taken place, the tribunal is going to focus its analysis on the two most relevant areas that have been provided through the crimes against humanity and war crimes. These are the strategies to appropriate and control territory and what is considered or known as the false positives. The strategies to appropriate and control territories. At the end of 2019, Colombia had the highest number of internal displaced people, with about 8 million people according to government numbers. The individuals are expelled from their territories for different reasons, but a very significant amount of the forced displacements in Colombia have to do with the armed conflict on the one hand, as well as the occupation for the implementation of legal or illegal development projects, where we often see large-scale national, multinational, and transnational companies, as well as the participation of national companies. As we see that this displacement affects indigenous and Afro-descendant populations, the impact is more than just losing their livelihood, because it also impacts their identity due to the special ties that these communities have with the lands where they have lived for generations. The armed actors need to consolidate the territorial control to have the resources that they need to have to carry out their military projects, and that's why they carry out strict social control, which includes the pillaging of the territory. Territory control can be understood as actions such as confinement, the limited access to food, sexual relationships, torture, murder, and sometimes the expulsion of a community or part of the community because it does not accept the demands or because it is collectively stigmatized and accused of collaborating with the alleged enemy. In the prioritized cases, by the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, we see the first case that has to do with the municipality in Tumaco, Ricardo, in Barbacoas, in the Department of Nariño. The second is the case related to Urabá, Darién, and Bajo Trato regions in the Chocó. The third is the case in relation to the 17 municipalities in northern Cauca and the south of Valle de Cauca. The crimes committed in Cajabillo in the same department have also been denounced before the tribunal. But they're not the only cases. There are also cases that have been documented and reports in relation to Meta, Caquetá, and Guaviare. On many occasions, we also see that the motivation behind the enforced displacement is directly tied to the will to implement banana, livestock, and extractive projects, which requires emptying the territory and the resistance to the imposition of the different projects. It is esteemed that the military and paramilitary projects have pushed a large part of the population off their land to then implement oil palm, sugarcane, extractive projects such as mining and oil. And others have presented themselves as good faith occupiers within the land restitution project. And this is not something of the past. We see that of the massive displacement that were reported in 2020, 50% took place in the 4 Pacific departments. These are Chocó, Valle de Cauca, Cauca, and Nariño, which are mostly occupied by Black and indigenous populations. We see that the displacement and terror leads to displacement by different armed groups who are acting in the service of private companies and often together with state security forces. And when the displaced people have legal orders to return to their lands, they once again find the same violence that impedes access to their rights. We see that there's currently systematic attacks and generalized attacks against the populations that allow us to talk about specific crimes against humanity, and in some cases also war crimes. We see there are multiple crimes that are used to provoke the enforced displacement of the population, which is a crime against humanity in these specific regions. The issue of false positives. When part of the enemy is identified with a part of the civil population, it justifies the attack against this population. We see that there needs to be the principle of distinction between civilians and non-civilians or combatants. We say there's a systematic vulneration of the civilian population's rights through the use of stimulation or economic incentives, and also pressure from commanders to attack the alleged enemies. We see that the numbers of deaths in the different communities is a base whether they should stay or not, or whether they should be promoted. This is all dependent on the number of deaths that they are able to generate. We see that real victims who are presented as individuals killed in combat. That is the definition of this false positive. These are young people who are stigmatized as enemies or are vulnerable populations who are kidnapped or convinced to go to look for alleged employment. And these individuals are often murdered, and then they are dressed as guerrilla members and armed and presented as individuals killed in combat. In accordance with the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, these are extrajudicial killings in the context of the Colombian armed conflict with modus operandi that's characterized by the death of civilians that are later presented as member of legal armed groups that are killed in combat, using different mechanisms with distortion and manipulation of the crime scene. End of the quote. This practice was carried out in a majority of the country's departments, and we see a highest number between 2004 and 2008. It must have the knowledge and support of the chain command, which compromises the responsibility of commanders due to action or omission, as well as the murder of civilians carried out in the context of the internal armed conflict are war crimes. And because they are murders that are carried out within the context of a systematic attack against the civilian population, these kinds of extrajudicial killings should also be considered crimes against humanity. And regarding the last section of this chapter, which has to do with impunity and serious human rights violations, I'm just going to read a few segments due to the lack of time. So the defense of the actions of the Colombian state has stated that it has ratified the main international human rights treaties, but that's not sufficient to issue laws or sign international human rights treaties. These standards must be applied. Colombia is not just lacking in its application of the human rights policies, but it must protect as well as investigate and punish the responsible parties of the human rights violations. And so in this case, there needs to also be reparation due to the damage caused in relation to violations committed by state forces or individuals, whether those be private security forces, paramilitaries, or legal or illegal companies. The main problem in Colombia is structural impunity and the fact that there are legal system that theoretically would be able to prosecute these issues. We see that this is not, these actions are not carried out adequately and in a timely manner in response to grave human rights violations. The lack of examples of convictions or rulings in relation to human rights violations illustrates the grave situation in the country today. Also, the Truth Commission, which must carry out its work over a 3-year period, has suffered multiple verbal attacks in the mass media from members of the government party through social media, attacking its president and its members, and accusing them of having ties to armed groups or having illogical bias, which is a reflection of the huge resistance of those people who have benefited from the armed conflict and the events mentioned before, and in their effort to hide the truth in relation to these incidents. Thank you so much. Thank you, Antonio Pigrao, on the legal qualifications. I'm going to hand over the last part to Felipe, who will read the recommendations.
Audio, Felipe.
Good morning, everyone. As my colleagues have mentioned, I'm going to have to read just part of the ruling due to the time restrictions that we have. So the People's Permanent Tribunal, in its 40th session on a political genocide in Colombia, which is opened in Bogota on January 26th of 2021 and carried out in the sessions held in Bucaramanga, Bogota, and Medellin on the days 25th, 26th, and 27th of March. Having listened to, in the public hearing, to the accusations from the demanding organizations and the testimonies from victims and representatives of social, trade union, peasant, student, LGBTI organizations, as well as women's organizations, individuals in Colombians in exile from political and parties and movements, as well as indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, having listened to the defense assigned to the Colombian state, having analyzed the complaints, testimonies, and petitions in the context of the Declaration, Universal Declaration of People's Rights, as well as the conventions and international declarations that are relevant to this issue, and as well as the standard principles and standards on international law. In the use of the attributes granted to the statute for the disposition and authorization of individuals, organizations, communities, and people to participate in the session, we present the following ruling. First, considerations on the general framework. This tribunal has characterized the set of facts analyzed during the long historical period that has been studied in this session as ongoing genocide committed against a part of the national Colombian community. Hence, the extermination of specific groups which have an ethnic, political, or social character is seen in the global scenario, and over time, the genocide to transform the plural reality of national groups, eliminating those who are not thought to have a space within this national identity according to the conceptions of who has conceived and carried out the genocide. As was indicated in other places, the set of state violence and parastate violence has been at the service of a systematic, organized, and demonstrated attempt to partially destroy the Colombian national identity, which looks through state actions and paramilitary groups to break apart and transform social relationships within Colombian society, eliminating through terror and perceptions of identity, forms of militancy, structures of meaning, organizational methods, traditions, dreams, the life projects of thousands of Colombians who have been ripped from their possible identity and that of their community. when we're talking about war crimes or crimes against humanity, and what was established on January 7th of the same year, Francisco Ledru, the president of the Truth Commission, in a presentation before the European Parliament, and this process has allowed for the economic and business elites of Colombia, both in rural and urban areas, to conceive and increase their position of power and to perpetuate extreme inequality, and with connivance with the major transnational interested transnational companies, and with the occupation of large parts of the country to carry out huge agro-industrial projects, as well as lumber, mining, hydroelectric, and oil projects, which are both legal and illegal. A process that has very visible effects and has led to, in large part, the displacement of over 8 million Colombians and over 8 million hectares of land that had been taken or abandoned. According to the data, we see that 42.5% of the population is facing a monetary poverty in Colombia. This is a 6.8% increase, and extreme monetary poverty was 15%, which is a 5.5% increase compared to the numbers registered in 2019 nationally. Between 2019 and 2020, 3.5 million Colombians entered monetary poverty, and 2.8 million entered the ranks of extreme monetary poverty. According to information provided in May, the relationship to land ownership, 2,300 individuals control 53.5% of the land. In the criminal process that has been carried out over decades, and the dynamics that we have described here have been used in a generalized and ongoing way by the state forces, but also by paramilitary groups. In the implementation of the paramilitary structure in Colombia has been essential. It's been essential, the participation of the United States. However, I'm not going into more detail on this point. Law 1975 of 2005, which should have led to the termination of the AUC, or the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, was essentially a symbolic conclusion of the paramilitary structure in Colombia. However, the phenomena continued under other names with close ties to drug trafficking structures. Another of the manifestations is reflected is that when there was a peace agreement and consequently demobilization process of a guerrilla group, they have proceeded in persecuting and trying to exterminate the demobilized individuals to impede their normal civilian life. You see the case of the Patriotic Union in May 1985, which was legally constituted as a political movement. This is also the case, a significant case of the assassination of Carlos Pizarro, who was the presidential candidate for the political party Alianza Democrática M19 in April of 1990, after the peace agreements on that same year between the Vigilio Barco government and the M19. All transition process is complex and has challenges. However, the essential framework is a political will to carry it out in an effective manner. And so in the Colombian case, there has not been a true political transformation that leads to a deep-seated transformation that allows for a rupture with the discourse of the internal enemy and the justification of the violence against dissidents and social protests. must be based, this transformation must be based on the respect of human rights. The absence of substantial changes in relation to the military forces and the police has shown dramatically with this wave, this current wave of violence in Colombia in response to the national strike, where we have seen the participation of civilians in this violence. In relation to that, on May 13th, the social judicial collective Orlando Falsborna and other organizations presented a communication to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, saying that since April 28th up through May 10th of 2021, that 40 individuals had lost their life due to police actions in the context of social protests, specifically due to the indiscriminate use of firearms in the cities of Cali, Pereira, and Ibagué. Additionally, 435 individuals have been reported as disappeared, and 1,365 individuals were detained. Along the same lines, there was information that was received on more than 129 individuals who were victims of torture in the hands of the police, and 16 have stated to be victims of sexual violence during police procedures. We are in an international context of the growing limitations of rights and the criminalization of social protests. But the Colombian version is an extreme example of this tendency and is a reflection without doubt of the historic path of political violence that we have described in this ruling. The General Secretary of the United Nations, Antonio Gutierrez, has asked the Colombian government to prioritize the protection and safety of FARC-EP ex-combatants and the communities affected by the conflict, as well as social leaders and human rights defenders in 2021. During the presentation of the quarterly report of the verification mission in Colombia before the Security Council in January of 2021. The second point is the considerations in relation to the individual criminal responsibility. As was indicated in other points, the People's Permanent Tribunal is not a criminal tribunal. The Inter-American Human Rights Court, which repeatedly responds to grave human rights violations in Colombia, is not a criminal tribunal either, and it can only establish the responsibility of the Colombian state in relation to the violation of protected rights established in human rights treaties on the Latin American level, which have been accepted by Colombia. So we see in Colombia that there's a major violation of human rights of all the individuals, of all the victims. Also, Colombia has not yet developed its criminal responsibility, which means that this is a major limitation in relation to the criminal prosecution of the above-mentioned crimes. 3 considerations in relation to the political and moral responsibilities. In the analyzed period, we see that the governments led by the following presidents, there are more than 20 presidents during the period between Mariano Pérez from the 40s and 50s through the current period, starting in 2018 with Iván Duque Márquez. And so the description of the ruling, we've mentioned the role of each of these governments and the involvement of each of them in the detailed process mentioned before is not homogeneous. We said that there are periods where there has been intensification of criminal activities and others where there's been a reduction in intensity, but none of these governments have established a radical rupture with the practices that we have indicated, and nor a serious intent to carry out a social reform, or that questions the continuity of the political and economic privileges that underline these acts of genocide and the commission of crimes, nor a change in the acts of impunity that have allowed for these crimes to continue during the entire period. However, perhaps the figure of ex-President Álvaro Uribe Vélez is the individual who best reflects this extreme version of this scenario that we have been referring to. A large landowner and cattle rancher who was a councilperson and mayor of Medellin and governor of Antioquia when they established the Convivir, which is the oversight and security cooperatives for agricultural defense. This, the president to establish the Self-Defense Forces of Colombia, or AUC, which is also tied to the Medellin cartel. Under his mandate, there was an intensification of the policy of terror, as well as backing for these actions within the mass media. We see that there's a formalization of the policy called democratic security, a multiplication of paramilitary actions, at the same time penetrating the executive, legislative, and judicial branches, what is known as parapolitics, as well as the DAS, Department of Administrative Security, in mayor's office, governor's office, as even universities. We see that there is an increase in the persecution of social leaders and community leaders, and people are massively evicted from their lands, and we see that there's a huge increase in the numbers of cases of sexual violence. Doors are opened to the penetration of mass action, or the mass penetration of transnational companies. We see that there's an increase of war-like actions and that lead to what is known as the false positives. And there's a consolidation of the US military bases in Colombia. There were different political and criminal actions related to the corruption, bribery, and the manipulation of witness. And he is the main opposition party in relation to the peace agreements of 2016. So due to all of the People's Permanent Tribunal states and convicts the successive Colombian governments starting in 1946, due to the participation, whether it be direct or indirect, through action or omission, in the commission of an ongoing genocide that seeks to destruct or partial destruction of national groups in Colombia, individuals who are questioning the current political model and any kinds of protest or resistance to these models. The genocide has had a specific projection in different groups on a national level, specifically trade union and peasant movements, indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, as well as political movements and groups. The organizations that defend human rights and the environment, as well as their respective leaders. This genocide has been manifested specifically in different modalities. We're talking about the killing of members of the group, serious wounds against or damage against the physical or mental integrity of the members of the groups, as well as the intentional submission of the groups to conditions that lead to or promote their physical destruction, both total or partially. So the direct or indirect participation in the commission of crimes against humanity and war crimes against the civilian population. Among the first is the murder, extermination, forced transfer of the population, the incarceration or other serious privations of liberty. We see torture and violations, rapes, the persecution of collectives or groups that have political or ethnic identities, as well as the enforced disappearance of individuals. Among the seconds, we specifically see those that are reflected in Article 3 of the point 4 of the Geneva Convention of 1949, where we see acts against civilians, and specifically homicide in all of its methods, mutilations, cruel torture or treatment, and as well as executions that are not related to trial, regularly established trial. Due to the non-fulfillment of their obligations to prevent, investigate, and punish genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity, both those committed by state agents as well as those committed by private actors, including specifically paramilitary groups, as well as an attempt to repair the victims of these very serious crimes in line with the internationally recognized rights. For having adopted military doctrines and strategies based on the existence of an internal enemy, which destroys the basic distinction in international humanitarian law between combatants and civilian population, and which have guided for decades the actions of the state forces and other state apparatuses, backing the commission and covering up of grave crimes, for having facilitated the expulsion of millions of individuals from their lands, whether that is through legal norms, state actions, the lack of actions in relation to the expulsion of individuals by paramilitary groups in the service of private interests, and for having allowed for an occupation of these lands by both companies that carry out legal and illegal businesses, for having promoted or allowed for the serious impacts against the territories and the ecosystems to implement economic projects that have led to the eviction or expulsion of populations from their lands, specifically indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peasant communities, actions carried out with the connivance of paramilitary groups, national and transnational companies. The racist component, institutionalized racist component that we see in the victimizing acts, specifically against indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, and the types of crimes, specifically enforced displacement, produced against these specific population groups, as well as a violation of their collective rights to land, natural resources, their rights to participation, and their cultural identity. For having promoted or facilitated paramilitary activities, for having promoted or facilitated the activities of paramilitary groups, specifically in the creation of a legal framework in 1965, which became the legislation that was established in Law 48 of 1968, and through the creation of the Convivir in 1994, and for having allowed for or promoted the cooperation between these groups and the state security forces in the commission of the grave crimes aforementioned in this ruling. So the creation or the narrative that is established in the mass media that uses the dislegitimization or stigmatization of any reivindication has been significant against individuals and collectives, specifically against communities and human rights defenders. For the undue use of criminal law to criminalize individuals and groups who have exercised their right to protest and to defend human rights, artificially constructing imaginary charges and using false testimonies with the aim of removing these individuals from their political or social activities and impacting thus the rest of the communities are members of a collective. Specifically, that the actual government, due to non-fulfillment of the acquired commitments in relation to the peace agreement, and specifically what we have addressed here in this tribunal, the agreement on the reincorporation of the FARC-EP into the civilian life, specifically the economic, social, and political spaces, as well as the guarantee on safety and the fight against the criminal organizations responsible for homicide and massacres and attacks against human rights defenders, social movements, political movements, including the criminal organizations that have been called the inheritors of the paramilitary structure and their support networks, as well as a persecution of the criminal behavior that attacks the peace agreement and peace building, and the agreement on victims, and the creation of the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, which is not receiving the appropriate support from the government. As well as the successive governments of the United States starting in 1946 for the exportation of the criminal ideology that backs the creation of the internal enemy, the paramilitary structure, as well as the repression of political and social opposition, as has been seen in one of the sections of this ruling due to its decisive participation in the support of Colombian governments, and specifically in the political plans as well as economic and military spaces for the creation and maintenance of the general framework that has allowed for the violation of human rights and the commission of genocide and the crimes that have been mentioned previously. In relation to the national and transnational companies that have participated in the serious human rights violations that have been described in this ruling. In some cases, by means of direct and active participation, and in other cases through a participation as instigators, financiers, or accomplices, frequently receiving economic benefits from the existence and the characteristics of the armed conflict in Colombia, as well as the violations of rights that have taken place in this context, specifically the forced displacement of the population. Its influence is particularly noted in relation to the violation of labor rights and freedom of association, the right to life and dignity, and the life of workers and their communities, as well as the collective rights to land, natural resources, and self-government, cultural identity, the rights to participation, and the development of their own frameworks of the indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples. And now we'll move on to the recommendations. According to this framework, in the tradition of this sentence of the tribunal in relation to the creation of doctrinal tools and the construction of tools to recognize and restitute the concrete fundamental rights of the peoples, the recommendations are essential, and specifically in Colombia, because since the session in 2008, we have seen that the conviction against the Colombian government for its participation in the violation of human rights and homicide, and there's been a series of recommendations that have not had any follow-up or implementation. And so the recommendations are as follows. First, for the Colombian government, to respect and ensure the respect of human rights, as they are part of their obligations to fulfill the 1991 Constitution, the Convention of Human Rights of 1966, as well as the American Convention on Human Rights of 1969, which obligates the prevention, investigation, trial, and punishment of all human rights violations, as well as the reparation of damages made to victims. The application and facilitation of the application of the 2016 peace agreement and all of its components, and specifically the comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, in which the government has not provided the appropriate support to facilitate its function, both for the special jurisdiction for peace as well as the ordinary justice system, to implement its recommendations, to facilitate the reincorporation of ex-combatants from the FARC-EP to fight against the criminal structures that are responsible for homicides and massacres, or that carried attacks against human rights defenders, social movements, as well as political movements, including the criminal organizations that have been called the inheritors of the paramilitary structure, as well as its support work. And needs to be a persecution of its criminal behaviors that threaten the implementation of the peace agreement and peace building established in the agreement. To denounce the military doctrines and strategies based on the existence of the concept of the internal enemy as a violation of international humanitarian law. Proceed with the full restitution of the lands taken from millions of individuals, and that has allowed for the occupation and exploitation of these lands by companies, both legal and illegal, as well as the reintegration of the individuals who have been expelled from those lands. Stop victimizing the indigenous peoples as well as the Afro-descendant communities, treating them as internal enemies and practicing against them institutionalized racism. Punish the crimes committed against these communities, specifically forced displacement, allowing them to return to their ancestral communities and ancestral lands. Make the commitment to restore and carry out comprehensive reparation of the territories that have been violated, and respect the decisions and visions of the indigenous peoples, the Afro-descendant communities, as well as the peasant communities in relation to development, self-determination, and their relationship with nature. Respect the freedom of association and protect unions to definitively break away from the unfortunate record in Colombia as one of the countries with the highest number of murdered unionists. Effectively fight against violence against women and investigate, try, and punish these crimes, specifically feminicides, and more generally, watch and ensure the respect of the right to equality between men and women. Stop sustaining and providing coverage to the activities of paramilitary groups, which implies specifically dismantling the legal framework that was created with this aim, starting with Legislative Decree 3398 of 1965 up through Law 48 of 1968, dissolve the associations, convivir, and attempt and ensure that the armed forces never again cooperate with these groups. Stop using unduly a criminal law to persecute and prosecute individuals and groups that carry out their right to protest in the defense of human rights. Constructing artificial charges or imaginary charges and using false witnesses. Duly sanction the authors of extrajudicial killings of civilians, showing them to be combatants these are actions known as false positives, and take all measures so that these crimes are not repeated. Proceed with the demilitarization of the country and carry out a specific reform of the police to create a true civilian police force that is at the service of the individuals and the population, that doesn't have any ties to the military structure. And respect the recommendations of the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights in response to the numerous rulings from the Inter-American Court guaranteeing a true and adequate reparation of the victims of human rights violations, specifically in the case of the political genocide against the Patriotic Union. Reinitiate ongoing and permanent cooperation between Colombia with international organizations, specifically the human rights entities of the United Nations, reestablishing a dialogue with the special rapporteurs and inviting them to visit the country. To the government of the United States, definitively abandon the exportation of the ideology that you have used with successive Colombian governments. You consider part of the population as the internal enemy, fomenting paramilitarism and repressing political and social opposition. For the fulfillment of the peace agreement, it is essential to have a deep-seated change in the policies that are still carried out with Colombia, which is a country that has a strategic and militarized role in the region, with all the implications that has on a political, institution, economic, and social level, and from the security logic, which becomes an ongoing practices of genocide, as have been documented in this ruling. The United States must close the School of the Americas, which has carried out huge damages against the Latin American people, is a focus point of exporting war against the civilian population and carrying out torture throughout the region. To all the states that have supported the peace agreement, continue supporting the process, carrying out oversight, specifically on its full implementation in relation to the specific obstacles presented by the current government of Colombia, and condition any sort of financial support that's necessary to ensure the fulfillment, and immediately that the Colombian government stops its current policies of repression against citizen protesters. For the European Union, the long history of continued genocide and impunity that has been carried out in Colombia, specifically over the last 2 decades of the 20th century, thanks also to the policy of silence and connivance from the European countries, either due to a full absence of initiatives in relation to the evident, serious, systematic, and ongoing crimes that have been documented in this ruling, or due to the political and economic backing from European countries that have had a negative impact, a very significant negative impact on the sectors and territories most affected by the violence and repression, as well as against the life and well-being of the peasant, indigenous, and Afro-descendant communities through Colombia. There needs to be a radical review and independent of the United States policies of the current policy. This must be an absolute priority in the EU agenda to reivindicate its fundamentals based on a full and complete respect of human rights and the people's rights. And this is expressing its commitment publicly in the documentation of the declaration in relation to the European consensus of our world, our dignity, and our future, which is jointly adopted by the European Union institutions in June of 2007, or what is established in the European Action Plan for Human Rights and Democracy 2020-2024. The national and transnational companies may carry out your activities in Colombia under strict respect of labor rights, specifically freedom of association, and respect of all human rights, prohibiting enforced displacement of the population, respecting the right to life and the dignity of workers and their communities, as well as the rights to collective land, natural resources, self-government, and cultural identity, the right to participation, and the development of their own actions as in indigenous, originary, and Afro-descendant communities. To the International Criminal Court, that now, without delay, you begin to investigate Colombia. This investigation, which began in June of 2004, not just on crimes against humanity and war crimes, but also taking into account genocide, taking into account the grave nature of the crimes, the number of victims, the ongoing nature of these actions, as well as the persistence of structural impunity. It's ununderstandable that this investigation has not been implemented when there have been, this ruling has been made or decision been made in cases that are not as grave. To the comprehensive system for truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, it is essential to continue acting with the aim of recognizing the rights of the victims to truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, with specific attention given to the effective participation of victims and their family members in the procedures, and specifically recommended in the set of actualized principles for the protection and promotion of human rights by means of the fight against humanity, and by the Inter-American Human Rights Court. The strength of the evidence presented to the PPT underscores that the peace process must turn into an effective process to to restore the rights of the Colombian people with the inclusion and promotion of structural changes. This is essential to guarantee non-repetition. For the fulfillment of the mandate of the comprehensive system must be explicitly rated as a first phase that correctly defines the conditions to continue, to integrate, to monitor, and to establish credibility of this important mission is guaranteed with the corresponding support from the international community. Even though the atrocious repression of the massive and peaceful protests accompanies the reading of this ruling, it's essential to show that they indicate the favorable, the essential, the essence of the will and responsibility of substantial changes in the government system. It's only in an authentic and democratic process that we can be a acceptable reivindication and implementation of everything that's established in the comprehensive system to translate the memory of genocide and continue forward in a new culture of peace and with life projects that are viable for the vast majority of the population. In conclusion, the organization of the session of the PPT was possible thanks to the unending and valiant work of many social organizations in Colombia, as well as trade unions, human rights associations, indigenous communities, Afro-descendant communities, peasant groups, political movements, social leaders, women, youth, and students. In specifically difficult situation due to the context of conflict, repression, and major challenges that ratify the ongoing presence of and process of genocide that has been shown and denounced in the PPT. The work of the PPT has shown that the limits of this inevitable synthesis about how and when the history of genocide is, ongoing genocide in the Colombia is part of the memory and the representation of the history, and regardless of the material differences and the actors and context. In the long history of the PPT, maybe never before, as we've seen in this session, has it been as clear that there's the need, that even more in this global world, that it's the people that with their diverse complementary struggles, these are subjects that can investigate, to experiment, to share a right of the people and of the land. That this is one of the essential struggles and challenges of the future. And so thanks to the PPT, we thank the Colombian people. Thank you for their struggle and their alliances to create a world for the common well-being. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias a Philippe por esta intervención que hace, por la lectura de este fallo y las recomendaciones que desde el Tribunal Permanente de los Pueblos se hace al Estado.
From your recommendations, we also want to thank all those representing the jury of this 48th session of the People's Tribunal who have helped us read this ruling of such consequence. We want to greet all the guests who are connected to this transmission, and we want to remind you that you can follow us on social networks and accompany us with the hashtag No Más Estado Genocida, no more genocidal state. We now hand the floor to Ms. Ángela María Buitrago and Mr. Iván Velázquez, recognized Colombian attorneys who are the prosecutors in this session and who were also granted an intervention. Thank you and good afternoon all the panel members and all the people intervening in the session. As a prosecutor or as part of the prosecution, And as a spokesperson, I want to recognize the value of this decision issued by the tribunal, particularly in recognizing a valuable, courageous, and questioning decision of what can be understood as genocide, and particularly the continued genocide of a national group, as has been quite academically and interestingly explained, which can also lead to the determining how there are mandatory processes within the Colombian or international systems that can take from this general historical and geopolitical context that the People's Tribunal has highlighted, this violence, this generality of multiple causes, methods, and forms, as has been explained in this ruling, that today gain even more importance with respect to Colombian reality that has not stopped for over a century. So this becomes a milestone for historical analysis of the past, of the present, and hopefully it will serve as a calling from a historical standpoint to take the measures needed to prevent the transformations of these populations, the loss of identity, these practice of biosecularity, oceanic control, convergence, massive dispossession, and for the prosecution, the juridical structuring around the concept of genocide, of continued genocide, is very valuable, that seeks to account for a construction of processes of destruction, and that finds in all evidences and statements given by the peoples, by the organizations and the prosecution, the loss of identity after 60 years of transformations of identity patterns, political characteristics, and other specificities in the construction of social bonds that are impacting national people, the Colombian identity, and the persistence of a national perspective. So let us see how the interrelations between these groups show us that it is clear from that ruling to ensure a process of a long-haul political process, because there has been a continued destruction of this national group. There is no doubt that we need to recover the need to indict and to make responsible and to find the persons responsible and to try the persons responsible for this genocide. And even if the ruling of the People's Tribunal is not binding, it is mandatory from an ethical and constitutional standpoint in terms of enforcing and meeting the rights of the Colombian state, given the forced violation of human rights. From this standpoint, the social practices that are being driven to exterminate and to discriminate, but they also recognize a legal phenomenon, that it is genocide. It's a genocide that encompasses other genocides recognized as this tribunal. Some genocides are political, racial, ethnic in nature, but are fundamental within the understanding, the need of preservation of our species and the understanding of an. This prosecution also wants to recall certain arguments that are especially important, particularly the counterinsurgent strategy that has affected the practical model of a nation, where they justify any human rights violations always with this common enemy of communism. And this is fundamental. We see it today in the protests, and this is current, and these human rights violations are current in Colombia in 2021. So I want to especially recognize this theoretical and practical aspect that has been analyzed within this ruling. There is no doubt that there is also an invitation, as the ruling says, through the different discourse and statements by high members of hierarchies, to create these divisions and these conflicts between the ideal understandings, whether actual or imaginary, that lead people to take ownership of the effects of a genocide and understand annihilation as the suppression of a part of ourselves. I believe that this is necessary, that we understand this part of the ruling as a direct result, and the fact that what they are annihilating is Colombian people, Colombian identity. And based on these assumptions, analysis is fundamental through this ruling and through these arguments. There is no doubt that the destruction is not only proven by this decision, but it is a clear and permanent form by the Colombian state to use all possible forms of annihilation, discrimination, extermination, and of course, non-recognition of the other. The purpose of the genocidal process, and I want to highlight this as the ruling says, is to disrupt identity. And it not only happens from practices of annihilation, but it also materializes in the modalities that it has been shown, the patterns of destruction, of annihilation that have been going on in Colombia for over 70 years. The peace process should take into account all the arguments in this ruling, the HEP, the Truth Commission, and the internal procedure should be put in place to reinstate and to use the elements that have and to understand the elements that have been in Colombia and that have entailed deaths and disappearances and other crimes that are war crimes and crimes against humanity. There is no doubt that war and violence and armed conflict cannot be an excuse for these violations to be committed. From this point of view, we must not only highlight elements discussed in this ruling, but other elements that the prosecution wants to put on the table. The permanent, ongoing, repeated, and recurring impunity that is seen, planned for, structured, that seeks to maintain the status quo and to maintain all the assumptions or the benefits of the oligarchy, to prevent the recognition and the sanction of the breaches by majority groups. Another point that we want to highlight as the prosecution is the manner that the ruling encompasses a national group. I think that not only by analyzing these 52 cases, these 7 groups and the 3 cross-cutting elements that were analyzed, there is a process. We can see that there is a process of conservation of the elites and the power hierarchies that must be understood and seen by the Colombian judges and the Colombian justice, and that must be a clear search for justice to prevent this phenomenon to continuing from happening, as the ruling states. I also want to highlight a point of the ruling: poverty in Colombia. Our downfall that has led us to great differences between the Colombian people. And this has also been subject to the power and to the control through policies of segregation and through opening spaces for extractivism that causes the spaces for greater poverty. The Permanent People's Tribunal, even if it cannot determine a criminal liability, nor can it determine a mandatory sentence. It does mark fundamental elements to be taken into account both nationally and internationally in the procedures on the proceedings of the International Criminal Court, where there has been a succession of control and power that has Colombia submerged in this genocidal process. So to enclose a fundamental human right something that has led to the loss of lives and existence, which is also the impacts on the ecosystem as mentioned by the ruling, and that will cause in the end the loss not only of identity and the right of a dignified life for the Raizal communities and Colombian communities, but also to the loss of sustenance and in Colombia. This topic that gains importance under the light of DESCA rights and as built by the Inter-American Court implies a fundamental progress. And I want to thank the work of the tribunal, monumental work, not only in the quality of the evidence presented, but in such complex structuring of the juridical aspects. I want to, as a prosecutor, I want to thank you for being able to participate in this tribunal, to represent these groups, and I particularly want to thank the communities for having put forth so much effort in trying to recover their history and their accounts of their deaths and their serious violations suffered. So I will now hand the floor to Ivan Velázquez. I want to kindly salute all the members of the jury and members of the Permanent People's Tribunal who are following us in this reading of the ruling, given the such important role that it can meet in a country, particularly a pedagogical role. And after this ruling, we need to disseminate this, to discuss this publicly as a tool for citizen education. The way that our reality has been incorporated in the ruling after 70s, 100 years, the way that they have accounted for the actions of the elites through the different governments, particularly in these last 70 years, to eliminate dissidents, to eliminate the differences of those who have a different cosmic vision of the world of life and social relationships. A need that we have in Colombia for justice, for truth, for a true struggle and fight against impunity. As it was said in some section, we need to start calling things by their names. Stop euphemisms and come to the gist of the matters, of the things, to show our realities as they are. In many of these elements, it is pretty much a dense sentence or ruling that requires a broad process of assimilation and dissemination, because it must become an instrument for transformation. In our country, there's also an unkept promises. Of all these unkept promises within the peace accords, there's one that we need to enforce, which is the dismantling of the paramilitary phenomenon. This needs to be a nationwide commitment, with the participation of the international community also, and understanding, as we have insisted, to understand paramilitarism as a phenomenon that goes way beyond just the mere action of certain criminal groups, but rather it is ingrained in and rooted in several sectors and the conscience of several sectors of our society, which we've been able to see in Cali, in Valle del Cauca, in the actions of police civilians and firing against the protesters. What this has entailed, the support by civilians and by people to this police practices, paramilitary police practices, and this needs to take us beyond that. It is not only demilitarizing the country, it is also demilitarizing the citizens' conscience. And this government has greatly contributed, and the previous one with its propaganda apparatus, when despite this reality of criminality from the institutions, from the official side, there are always continuing to insist on the heroes, on our heroes or national heroes who we owe gratitude to because they are protecting us from this dangerous enemy that is jeopardizing our stability. I think that all such important recommendations formulated by the ruling, I want to highlight. On the one hand, the recommendation to the government to dismount paramilitarism, and this has to do with reinstating the land and modifying the legal framework that is protecting these practices of dispossession that we've said. It is not by one organization, it is the elites who are using this instrument of repression. Paramilitarism is not a phenomenon that is isolated. It is what the excluding elites have adopted as a tool for preserving the control and the power that they have over our country. On the other hand, there's a recommendation to the International Criminal Court, as it is said in the ruling, to, without further delay, open an investigation on Colombia, taking into account such seriousness of these crimes. And as Dr. Angela Maria was saying, there's also this issue of impunity. We are immersed in impunity, and this is also ensuring the repetition, the ongoing repetition of these criminal actions, the impossibility of a true social transformation that is being driven from the citizens, from the grassroots, because all perpetrators are encouraged by the fact that from the state there is no punitive response against their actions. And the same goes for truth. And there, in that same vein, I want to highlight the recommendation in general to the system, to the truth, redress, and guarantees of non-repetition system, but particularly to the HEP. I believe it is essential that the HEP, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, to examine its procedures so that it can hasten response to impunity. This delay, when we're facing a mockery by a person who is responsible for false positives, for extrajudicial, by General Mario Montoya of the victims of the JEP itself, sitting down in front of the judges to say that this was caused by ignorant soldiers that didn't even know how to use the silverware or the spoon or the fork, and who he had to teach to use the fork. And after 15 months, we are still waiting for procedures to be able to make progress in the investigation against Mario Montoya, against generals, against Mejia, generals such as Mejia, who have been accepted by the JEP, but who refuse to tell the truth and to recognize what has really happened. I believe that this invitation to the system in its whole, but particularly to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, JEP, has unprecedented importance. We are not facing the problem of rulings, that the problem that is always referred to in rulings, that whether if justice and peace took 5 years, JEP has been only going on for 3 years. No, we are facing a true problem here of impunity, of violence, of repression, and we are living it today. And this is a consequence also of the impunity and of the lack of truth in the past, which is a topic for the JEP to deal with in its competence until 2016. So I wanted to highlight this to enclose, because it is urgent for the JEP to examine how it can speed up the proceedings so that this impunity that we're suffering through still, despite the intervention of the integrated system, despite that, we're still failing to see at least a true movement against impunity, but barely glimpses. That precisely because there are glimpses, isolated glimpses, are just mere rays when we need a true sun shedding light on us. And it's the JEP that has a responsibility to help us and to help this sun shed light on all of us. Thank you for having shown and highlighted this reality, for having shown a relationship, the relations of this violence that we have lived through for decades, because this has to become an instrument for our struggle in our country, seeking to fight against impunity.
Thank you to both of you for your reaction to this historic ruling. We now will open the program space for the press conference, which will be moderated by Camila Lozano, who's in charge of communications for the People's Permanent Tribunal of Colombia. Camila will then explain the methodology for this press conference, and we'll open a space for the journalists who are connected with us today. We'd also like to remind you all that you can continue us on with social media with hashtag genocide continues and no more genocide state. Camila, please move forward with the press conference. Good morning. Hello to all the journalists who are with us this morning. So the dynamic is that we please try to be brief and concise in your questions. So you can request to ask a question via Zoom. And we'll go turn by turn, person by person, and then we will hand over the space to the jury so they can respond to the different questions. So we ask that the journalists who are present via Zoom, you can ask to speak. You can request your turn to be able to start this press conference. Meanwhile, I'm going to move forward with a few of the questions that one of our colleagues has sent us. She's had some problems with her microphone, so she's wrote the questions. The question is, what specific points are addressed in relation to genocide against women and other points specifically that have to do with the national strike. And so now we have another journalist who would like to ask their question.
Buenas tardes, ¿me escuchan?
Good afternoon, can you hear me?
Santiago, estás solicitando la palabra, Santiago Luque, de Rutas del Conflicto. Adelante.
So we have Santiago de Rutas del Conflicto. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Escuchamos, Santiago.
Bueno, pues digamos que felicitarlos a todos.
So I'd like to congratulate you all for this work and thank you for having invited us. And then one of the questions that I have is, what happens next for the People's Permanent Tribunal in Colombia? And for the future, will these valuable recommendations that you've made, will there be some sort of follow-up, or will there be a formal delivery of the recommendations to the state, or what happens next for the People's Permanent Tribunal in Colombia?
Gracias, Santiago.
Thank you, Santiago. Are there any other journalists who are here in the Zoom room who would like to ask another question? Or should we hand over the space to the jury?
Juan Sebastián Gil de Contagio Radio. Adelante.
We have Juan Sebastián Gil from Contagio Radio. Go ahead, please. Good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for this space from Contagio Radio. We'd like to ask in relation to you, even though the PPT is not binding for states and government, it has become a tool for organizations nationally and internationally for the enforceability of rights. So in the context of the actions carried out by the Truth Commission, and knowing that this ruling will be handed over to both the Truth Commission and the HEP, materially, how can this ruling contribute, for example, to the macro case on genocide that's before the special jurisdiction for peace?
Gracias. Juan Eduardo Gómez de Semanario Voz, por favor.
And thank you. We have one from Semanario Voz. So from Semanario Voz, we just wanted to ask what are the perspectives that you have on the actions of the international entities. Can you speak more specifically about what you mentioned this in the ruling, but how to access the international criminal courts or the UN, how to reach other entities where it's precisely possible for this ruling to have specific important weight in relation to the different processes and legal actions in relation to genocide carried out by the Colombian government. Another question, what should be the role of the people and governments of the world in relation to genocide? And so with that question, I will open up the space to the jury so that they can respond to that question, all of those questions.
puede hacer una respuesta parcial, ¿no?
So maybe we give you a partial response to some of your questions, but specifically in what is coming next after this ruling. We've seen in different opportunities that the ruling, or that all the rulings of the People's Permanent Tribunal can be a pedagogical tool, to explain and to respond. And so I think we will be evidently communicating with all the different Colombian entities, obviously, sharing the ruling, but also with the Truth Commission and all of the entities of the comprehensive system of truth, justice, reparation, and non-repetition, so that it can be a tool that they can use to establish more concrete actions and maybe to guide their understanding. Evidently, it's still very early to know exactly how we will be able to publish the ruling internationally, but as far as it's possible, we will attempt to present it to the UN entities, as well as other, the Human Rights Council, or European, or even US entities, or American entities, such as the Inter-American System. And so we'll need time to do that. But I think initially what's important is its dissemination in Colombia, sharing it with different entities that can do something that currently are acting, such as the comprehensive system. I'm sure my colleagues can add more detail to that, but that's just a very quick response. There's a question about the genocide against women. I'm not sure if one of my other colleagues would like to answer that question. In relation to follow-up, maybe our General Secretary, Janine Dugnon, can answer that question, but that was my initial response. I can say two things. Evidently, we will hand over all the information to the European Union and to everything possible to share the information with the European Union as one of the actors that's also included in the recommendations. But I think this most important starting point will be, as what one of the other prosecutors said, is that this ruling is a tool, and that even though it is very complex and very fine-tuned, is a tool that indicates the need for ongoing actions from the steering committee, not just in Colombia but also in other countries, so that the Colombian case can be a tool for the maybe the literacy training that has to do with so many episodes of repression, this ongoing repression that has transformed a society. A transformed society evidently isn't modified in a short amount of time. This is part of the possibility of creating true opposition, as one of the parties mentioned. And this cancellation of the self-awareness of the people's identity in Colombia, and it needs time to be recreated or reconstructed. So I think the ongoing work of the Truth Commission and others will be very important. And I also think that it's important to go back and look at the fact that there is political actions within Colombia, and that the peace process will only happen from inside Colombia. We will do what we can do as the People's Permanent Tribunal to create, as part of our closing, there'll be a ruling that's being provided to the society. We will do everything we can, but it's important to have dialogue on the other side that will guarantee the continuity. We need to have effective and ongoing efforts, which is evidently maybe the greatest challenge today. from an international level, we work also with other platforms and other groups, not just the 400 groups in Colombia that have been participating with us, but also others on an international level. And so it's important to carry out the transformation of the Colombian case in Colombia, but also internationally. And this is a challenge. This is a challenge for all of the communities. This is happening in Colombia. It can happen and is happening in other places, because we're aware that this mechanism of expropriation is part of the current policies. I'm not sure if anyone else, Luciana or Raul or anyone else would like to make further comments.
Bueno, yo quiero hablar desde lo que ha sido la experiencia de nosotros en México.
I'd like to speak from our experience in Mexico. So the presence of the People's Permanent Tribunal, it allowed us to, or it's the PPT's work has allowed us that we're able to, from different areas, human rights areas, we presented ourselves before the PPT with different organizations that were working in the different areas that, and it made it possible to go before the People's Permanent Tribunal to present each of our cases. And so the work of bringing together the issues and the different specific human rights violations, the work of bringing together all these different entities that were working on the issue of human rights violations. Just the fact that we were able to come together. This was a very pedagogical action. It was an experience where we were able to expand our understanding, our vision of the situation. Based on that, we were able to focus. This is one of the mechanisms of the Mexican government, with all of its accomplices, all the different actors and stakeholders, whether they're international governments or the governments of the different multinational companies that come in to exploit our resources, or it could be the direct intermission in the justice mechanisms, in the justice and control system, whether it's paramilitaries, as we see very clearly in this work that the Colombian citizens have carried out. So first, it's an awakening when the tribunal requires us to make this systematic presentation of what's happened, and when the tribunal presents its conclusions, we see very clearly, it's very easy for us to see this horrific structure which has these mechanisms from the inside, and that's what we need to fight against. That's what we need to establish this pedagogical process, speaking from who we are as the grassroots, as the human rights organizations. Once we have this additional clarity, and I see this experience through this entire process, is that we've done as the judges, or the jury of the PPT. I see very clearly that for the organizations, first understand that, well, first the organizations need to continue working together. They need to continue to be connected in their efforts. That, I think, is the first point. And second is that this process, this legal process, it's important. It says that the PPT is not does not have a binding ruling, but everything is organized. All the material is there, which makes it possible for citizens who are committed to the struggle for the respect for human rights, and for this struggle, which is a true emancipation of the Colombian people, to no longer be, to be oppressed by the hegemonic structure that has only allowed for one group or these controlled small groups of that they're controlling, and they're using this horrific weapon, which is genocide. So you all, the citizens, you have the citizens who have spoken out, and this is not the first time. This is the 48th session, and it's not even the first time in Colombia. So you have colleagues, friends in Colombia. You have this beautiful, fantastic material, and it's your turn now. You have the path before you to go before the International Criminal Court, with the Inter-American human rights system, and before the different tribunals that could act. But you, as a citizen, that's your role. This doesn't end here. It's not concluding here, because the material is present. And it's the same that we saw in Mexico, that there are individuals who maybe participated in the Permanent People's Tribunal. They have afterwards, they've helped us in many different aspects. And then it's the individuals who have participated in this process. We're here, we're still present. As I said at the beginning, we have this relationship that can strengthen our access to justice in our country. So I think the work of the tribunal is now in the hands of the Colombian people. This is an inheritance that you will now you have this beautiful resources, and specifically that has to do with understanding genocide, and this is an important reference point in relation to what is the identification of genocide, and then all of the elements to be able to to establish or to position this understanding of genocide in relation to the identity of the group. So when there's this narrative before, sometimes this narrative hasn't reached, hasn't gone as far as I could, but now with these new elements, the clarity of this genocidal process and practices, and so we have these objectives, and that we can then use those to move forward, and so that there is reparation, and that this history also, there's this reconstruction of the history to be able to understand, to be able to read what has happened in your past, or to bring this before the justice system, when there is a government that actually wants to look at, to respond to everything that's happened. You have this beautiful, so important information. You have these fantastic tools, and we need to continue. We need to continue forward.
Gracias. Loti, puedes tomar la palabra.
Thank you, Loti. So in relation to the specific points that the ruling addresses in relation to women, we see that this is present in all of the different elements and facts. Specifically, we see that there's increased visibility in relation to the Afro-descendant people, where in January 2019, the women represented 49.65% of the victims, of which over 400,000 are Afro-descendant people, and over 98,000 of them are girls. And so we also was indicated in the case that there's increase of visibility of the violence against women journalists and women human rights defenders. We can see that with journalists are specifically attacked by armed groups, by public employees, by drug traffickers to stop their investigative actions, their investigations of violence and other violations, as well as we see that for women human rights defenders face additional risks and threats due to gender stereotypes, that the attacks go from verbal abuse to sexual abuse and rape. Between 2017 and 2019, 107 women human rights defenders were murdered, and at least 37 suffered torture and sexual violence. Also, we have observed the recommendations that were presented by Dr. Philip. Thank you. And so thank you for the response from all of the jury, as well as the journalists who have been a part of this space. I'd like to remind you that for additional information, additional interviews, you can please write us to third session TPP. You can write us at that email address, third session TPP, and we'll provide the additional information that you require. So thank you, and we're going to close the press conference here.
Camila, y gracias también a los periodistas.
Thank you, Camila, and thank you to all the journalists who connected, and thank you for your questions. As Raúl was saying, Raúl Jurado, this is a historical moment that the country is going through. This is also a starting point, an awakening that allows us to continue going forward and try to meet all the demands for defending human rights in the country, and allows us also to demand for enforcement of each and every one of the rights that are enshrined in our Constitution and that have been affected throughout all this journey and our story. Thank you to all who logged in. Thank you for all the people who have attended this session today. We want to tell you that we will continue on social networks with the hashtag No Más Estado Genocida and with the hashtag Sigue el Genocidio. You can use these hashtags to put your messages on social networks and let us know your opinions of what you think about this ruling from the Permanent Tribunal. And now, having finished our session with the press, we will now proceed with the panel for this 48th session of the Permanent People's Tribunal. To start with this panel, we will give the floor to Father Javier Giraldo. He will talk about some of the what the scope of this ruling could be. And then we have Adriana Arboleda from Corporación Jurídica Libertad. And then we will have Leonardo Jaimes from the Pueblos legal team. We will now hand the floor to Father Javier Giraldo, who will talk about the scope of this ruling. First, I want to thank the Permanent People's Tribunal for this ruling that they have given us. Such a qualified, pluralistic, international jury that has drafted a truly exemplary, well-weighted decision that will serve as an instrument for all the victims in Colombia. For those who have followed the reading of this ruling, surely you have asked yourself about the nature of this tribunal, a tribunal that is not endorsed by any state or by any intergovernment body. From the beginning of the Permanent People's Tribunal, and from the Russell Tribunal, which was the predecessor of the Permanent People's Tribunal, many questions have been expressed, and there have many attributions given to the legitimacy, the representativity, the effectiveness, and the impartiality of the tribunal. I want to respond to some of these concerns with some small comments. The first question about how representative it can be and how legitimate. Since Bertrand Russell Tribunal, the Gaulle's response, the president of France's response to prevent the Russell Tribunal from occurring in France because all tribunals, why must they be linked to a state? Or he said that all tribunals must be linked to a state. And Russell answered, we represent no state's power, nor do we have the means to compel those responsible to appear before us as accused. We cannot pass sentence that would be enforced. But I believe that these limitations are truly virtuous. We are free to start a solemn and historical procedure without being linked to state obligations or purposes. We have the obligation of analyzing all the questions and issuing a statement on each of them after a rigorous investigation. And by doing it, we may help humanity understand why a small town or a small group of peasants has been suffering for over 20 years the attacks of the greatest industrial power on earth, with the most powerful military and cruel measures. I believe we have the right to conclude that there are needs to gather a solemn tribunal comprised of respected persons, people respected not for their power, but for their intellectual and moral contribution to what we optimistically call the human civilization. I will stop and ask someone to help me. I think I have a problem with speaking right now. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias al padre.
Thank you, Father.
Estas palabras que nos regalaba también. Vamos entonces a continuar con este
We will now
panel y para ello vamos a dar entonces la
continue with this panel, and we will now go with Adriana Arboleda. She's part of Corporación Jurídica Libertad, and with Adriana, we want to talk about the actual context in a country and the ruling of the Permanent People's Tribunal. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you to the Permanent People's Tribunal for this such an important and historical ruling for the social process in Colombia. And in the book, Violence in Colombia by Monseñor Guzmán, by Orlando Falz Borda and Eduardo Umaña, Luna, they tell how the repression in the 40s and the 50s, and the police is no longer a protector of order, but an agent of disorder and crime. But in its actions, that is of the police, is not isolated, but rather a response to the newly established role. The police adapts to the rules established by the governing powers. And they show how the violence is institutionalized and positively sanctioned. The authors point out how violence is legitimated as part of the state's functions. To this, there's in addition to this, there's the role of the judges whose actions sometimes lead to impunity. That is to the denial of justice. This legitimation of violence and denial of justice was strengthened since the 60s with the national security doctrine of the internal enemy and the development of the paramilitary strategy. The Colombian state designed and perfected a doctrine that allows to maintain the status quo and a privileged elite that for decades has legitimated repression and has repressed any expression of opposition and peaceful manifestation. We saw this clearly in the cases that we presented to the Permanent People's Tribunal, on which the jury and the judges have issued a statement today. Institutionalized repression has caused the extermination of political movements, of the peasant movement, of the workers and union movement, of the students movement, among many others. And therefore, it has not been possible to consolidate stable and long-lasting peace, as the governments from the last 50 years have preferred to use force and militarization as a way to face the social and political conflicts. They have betrayed the covenants of political negotiations with the insurgents, turning processes into new cycles of violence that allow them to remain in power. This reality was clear in the process between the Colombian government and the FARC guerrillas, establishing that there were certain lines that that were not negotiated, and the military doctrine facilitated that there were no transformations. So we need to identify the causes not only of the armed conflict, but the social and political conflict and the possibility of consolidating democracy. Since the 90s, social organizations have denounced that in practice, Colombia is a genocidal democracy that doesn't respect human rights or citizen guarantees. which we were able to express in the cases before the People's Tribunal, is that in this country, a very small minority has ruled over the blood of many people that have attempted changes in the political structure, in the economic structure, the social or military structure of the Colombian state. Today, we have attended the reading of this ruling. We are undergoing a new violence cycle and the most brutal repression against social sectors that mobilize and that protest within the framework of the national strike. At least 276 signatories of the peace accords have been killed since 2016. And in addition to that, there have been 1,000 social leaders or human rights defenders that have also been killed. Therefore, we cannot make the mistake of thinking that what we have lived through in the last 2 months or the last 2 years is new. On the other hand, on the contrary, it's part of a clear strategy of repression, of extermination, and of political genocide committed by the state and its political and economic allies that we'll hope will be clearly penalized and sanctioned in the report to be presented by the Truth Commission. Today, within the framework of the national strike that started on April the 28th, we're talking about 76 social leaders killed within the framework of this protest. But to these 76 victims, in addition to these victims, we have over 6,000 out-of-court executions recognized by the HEP. In the national protests, there have been violations against human rights, the same that have been denounced since the 40s. In this book, Violence in Colombia, Professors Fals Borda and Umaña Luna have shown that state repression was manifested through selective killings, torture, dispossession of land, among many other things. But today we see that selective killings and arbitrary detention and degrading, downgrading treatment, social violence, and forced disappearance continue to become systematic, generalized crimes in the country and are part of the institutionalization of violence. This official repression is what young men and women are using social media to document, directly showing what the law enforcement agencies are doing, and have proven that the military apparatus is a violent actor that is willing to do anything to remain in power. Amidst the protests of these last few days, we see how measures are being implemented that have been used since the mid-20th century, such as creating laws and regulations to limit legal freedoms. We saw that last April the 28th, a judge dared prohibit social demonstrations. There's also this stigmatization discourse used by from the official side that has been used systematically by saying that the protests are infiltrated by illegal armed groups. That with the purpose of taking legitimacy out of the protests, but also to ensure that public opinion will applaud repression, police brutality, and the use of force. The state apparatus establishes alliances for the official or private media to serve as propaganda machines to legitimate violence, to justify it, and to seek to earn the people's support. And they also meet the role of ensuring the deployment of the paramilitary strategy with no consequences, as Professor Ivan Velázquez was saying. Although the peace accords enabled a constitutional reform, I believe this is the only country in the world where we had to prohibit paramilitarism constitutionally. The peace accords then enabled the prohibition of paramilitarism, but the truth is that it not only remains in force, but it has been strengthened in the last few days. Now, using this discourse of legitimate defense, they are calling the good people, they're saying that the good people have the right to defend from the vandals and from the roadblocks, and they are accepting people for being attacked, the demonstrators from being attacked, and the prosecutor's office is not investigating these attacks, and thus the impunity cycle is closed. The state response to the demands for change against social inequality and human rights violations is clearly repression, not only in the country, but in the urban centers also, being an instrument that is being used by the state to eliminate all those who think differently. To show demonstrators as terrorists is a way of wiping out the social agenda, and the different sectors and guilds are making the demonstrations responsible for the country's problems. The economic guilds manage to maintain public power in their services and the wealth of the country in their personal riches at the expense of the opportunities and sustenance of over half of the country. All these events and the lack of investigation by the prosecutor's office, but also its links to the executive power and its mission to protect law enforcement and the state to deploy its criminal and repressive structure with no consequence. We're seeing how from the prosecutor's office and from the attorney general's office, they're trying to sanction the people from the Progresista caucus that have sought to protect the social demonstrations. They are trying to investigate the first line protesters or trackers, trackmen or human rights defenders who are in favor of the protests. That is why social mobilization in the country is so important, because it has shown the social mobilizations that are needed, the structural changes to help fight the causes of violence, inequality, and political control by a small ruling elite. From the social movements, we have promoted the Colombian state to be tried by the political genocide. We are convinced that we cannot continue to deny the institutionalized violence, and we need to recognize how the state has been the main violent actor that guarantees that a very few small extreme right-wing families and people remain in power, dispossess people from their assets while they are enjoying full impunity. The law enforcement should be transformed into a public force for peace, and that requires much more than a change of uniform. We require structural changes, such as reducing political and economic power, having smaller armed forces, and guarantee their investigation, trial, and sanction for their crimes. That is a main role of the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, dismantling the SMAD, among other things. Justification, denial cannot be the principles to characterize these institutions or any other institutions of the state. Today, more than ever, we must continue to show the genocidal practices that are reproducing and ensuring and guaranteeing state violence with the approval of the media. The ruling that was read today is a political instrument that must help us insist on the need of true democracy based on the comprehensive recognition of human rights and the rights of all living beings, the rights of peoples, the rights of nature, among others. The social struggle is also a struggle for peace. that allows for real transformations that go against all the factors that are the true causes of violence. It is a defense of peace processes to guarantee that there will be no more crimes against peace and to find a political negotiated exit to all conflicts. Today, we call upon the Special Jurisdiction for Peace and the Commission for Clarification of the Truth for them to understand that what we've lived through and we continue to live through in the country is a political genocide that will continue if we don't find out who was responsible, if we don't find true sanctions to investigate and to penalize systematic state crimes is the first step to advance in the consolidation of true democracy. Thank you very much. Thank you, Adriana, for your important analysis, for your comments on what we're living through in this historical times that Colombia is going through, and a relationship between this ruling today and the context. And you also talked about and showed us some of the practices that, how some of the practices that are being sanctioned by this ruling continue to happen once and again in our country. We want to send our support and a big hug to Father Giraldo, who was a little dizzy during his presentation. He's now recovering after his intervention. We will now continue with the intervention of Leonardo Jaimes, who is part of the legal team of Pueblos, and he will talk about some of their perspectives for action within the framework of this process of the tribunal. Leonardo, good afternoon.
I'm currently in the northeast of Colombia, fairly close to the people who have fought for their land in the east of Colombia, in Cesar, relatively close to Catatumbo, where just 5 days ago the peasantry, which was in the strike, the grassroots uprising, was shot at by the paramilitary structure and the state security forces. I'm also very close to an area where there is a military base with a presence of US soldiers. I'm very close, just blocks from where the student movement from the Industrial University of Santander has been participating actively in the national strike. And just last night, just hours ago, they were strongly repressed by the police, by the repressive forces. And as Bucaramanga is one of the cities that received the national army or the military forces. So for all of the social initiatives, the grassroots, student, trade union, people who have participated in this process, we are concluding this moment of the ruling. And this is a very significant phase that includes many grassroots initiatives. And so I'd like to congratulate the role of Father Javier Giraldo, who is a colleague in the struggle from Carmen de Chuquiri, where we met each other in the 80s and the 90s, where he has not rested for even a minute in the fight against impunity, against the state crimes, against the genocide that's taken place in Colombia. Father Javier and his walks through San Jose de Apartado requires a special recognition from the third session of the People's Permanent Tribunal in Colombia. Session 48 is possible due to the insistence of Father Javier. Javier, we send you a huge hug. The fight against impunity in Colombia, it continues. The ruling from the TPP and the declaration is another tool for the grassroots struggle, which for decades has looked for a society that's different to that that's been imposed by worldwide capitalism and US and European imperialism. This ruling obligates us as a victim of movement of victims, a human rights movement, and the grassroots movement to expand, to limit state terrorism. Understanding this as a category that is different repressive actions such as genocide as a social practice. So in line with that, from the different conventional spaces for justice, and specifically understood as the Colombian courts, clarifying that they're part of this genocidal practices, we should share the arguments and the rigorous documentation to ask for a conviction in relation to genocide. This is almost an impossible action, and it's only through mobilization and social pressure, like we've seen it happen with our colleagues in Argentina, that it'll be possible for Colombia to advance in decisions that make it possible to try the maximum responsible parties in the genocidal process in Colombia. This ruling must be known by the high courts of the Colombian justice system and must be shared with all of the judicial operators throughout the national territory. Obviously, this should be accompanied by protest and actions of memory, and obviously creating pressure and participating in the popular uprising that has been taking place in Colombia since April 28th. Also, this ruling is an exercise of grassroots power. This is an establishment of the administration of justice. This is the framework of the essential element of the ruling. This is an exercise that is established on principles and values that have been created from the people, and they show us the difference between the exercises of the hegemonic power. This is not a vindicative exercise. This is a reparative, a restorative exercise. So being able to achieve this ruling is important, but it's also a social obligation to understand as the people in the processes where we are participating to go beyond this ruling. This is the product of serious investigative work. This is documentation, systemization of information, the understanding of the reality. This is meetings. This is collecting interviews, having debates and discussions in different spaces and collectives, individuals who are victims of the genocide. So this isn't the exercise of the judicial system that has created this ruling to look for destruction and punishments. But no, this is a very serious discussion that we've been carrying out over this last year and a half based on the 2008 ruling. So this ruling is an exercise of memory, of living memory and transformative memory. This is a ruling that looks to protect many of the evidences that have been ignored or rejected by the traditional justice system. This needs to be a document that can be studied by the victims and its family members, by the human rights movement in general, by all the different spaces of the grassroots movement, as a document that is a tool for analysis, and it needs to be continually updated to look at this ongoing genocide process. So that's why this ruling does not conclude today. It's not the last word. We need to continue documenting. We need to continue discussing. We need to go into more depth and more intricate understanding of the situation. And that's why today I talk about including a recreation of the international humanitarian law, because one of the criticisms that we have is that it doesn't respond to what is happening in countries like Colombia. And so for that reason, this is a step forward to expand the understanding of the crime of genocide in the Rome Statute, in the International Criminal Court. This is a statute that is limited and without talking about or going beyond the understanding of genocide in Colombia. So this is an essential aspect of strategic litigation as part of the struggle that has been started by many of the victims to understand and typify this crime. And now we must break apart a mutilated, reduced concept that has been used by the imperialist states. So this ruling must be sent to the ICC. Just recently, we saw that the new prosecutor took took that position. This is an English person, a white person, a European person. And that will very possibly affect how they understand what's happening. They'll focus surely on Venezuela or Africa, but we need to ensure that this ruling is known by the prosecutor of the ICC, regardless of its limitations, because Colombia is, for the last several years, part of a preliminary study. So it's important to continue pressuring them to carry out, to open an investigation in relation to genocide in Colombia, because it has already been clearly shown and defined. And so, as it was mentioned, this ruling also needs to be sent to the High Court in Colombia, because they have not issued any rulings. There hasn't been any rulings in relation to genocide in Colombia. Not one at all in the Colombian courts. There have been one or other crime against humanity, but they are very limited. And so we need to continue moving forward with this category to ensure that they reflect what is happening in the country. What we see are crimes of power. This is a genocidal process that's been happening for decades. And this goes beyond just the concept of the armed conflict as established in the ruling. It's important to say that this is a timely ruling. Juan Manuel Santos had just went to the Truth Commission, and he banalized the concept of forgiveness. He banalized this forgiveness because he institutionalized and he positioned this bias, this slanted concept of truth. He used it to wash his hands in relation to the false positives and social killings. This ruling shows the contrary. We need to insist on the evidence that shows the rationality of the power and the crimes. Santos is not only asking for forgiveness for the Truth Commission, he needs to be tried for crimes against humanity. And so we see that there are different contributions from different struggles around the world. This is important to have this support. Cases and processes that have provided support from different areas of the world, from Argentina, Chile, even our brothers and sister countries in European countries. And so that's why I say, who are the jury? Who is the jury? These are jurists, these are intellectuals, these are people who have been part of the fight against impunity. And that's why we have the rich contributions from these different individuals. And that's why this ruling, as we mentioned before, needs to be known by Carica, the new International Criminal Court prosecutor. We can't forget that we're in the face of an ongoing genocide. And that's why the state response in relation to the popular uprising has been genocidal. And so there needs to be follow-up and monitoring of this ruling and its recommendation. And so that's why we're calling on the People's Permanent Tribunal to continue watching closely, to create mechanisms that are coordinated with the processes here in Colombia to monitor and follow up on the recommendations. Lastly, it's important to understand that there is an ongoing genocidal actions against the groups. That means that it's important that we need to continue to expand our resistance and to defend our identity as grassroots individuals. We need to destroy the strategic objective, and it's imperative. Thank you. Hugs for Father Javier. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for all the communities and the processes who have been part of this People's Permanent Tribunal. Thank you all. Thank you for your work. Thank you so much, Leonardo. Thank you for your important words. And thank you to all the delegates from the steering committee for your participation. We'd like to invite now Father Javier Geraldo to be able to continue his intervention that he had begun just shortly before. So now we open the space again for Father Javier. Sorry, that was just briefly was a little dizzy, so I'd like to go back to my words. We have a lot of, some people question the legitimacy of this tribunal. These are old objections. When it was things we heard when there was the first tribunal in Rosen, the initial, we saw that Rosa responded to the president of France and saying that they say that legitimacy of any tribunal is also always connected to a state, to a power. And Rosen responded that that a tribunal wasn't necessarily connected to this power of a state. And another of the members of the tribunal, a magistrate, a French judge, Manjung, who wrote different books about the rights of the people and people's rights, and the Rahel Declaration, contributed saying that international law showed the example, the concept of self-determination. And he said that before the concept of self-determination was tied, or was maybe better said reduced, to the concept of the decolonization process. However, the Rahel Declaration and the People's Permanent Tribunal were able to show that formal states, regardless of that they didn't have the true self-determination. And precisely the obstacle to reach self-determination as it has been evolving, that it was precisely in the hands of the states. And so one of the phrases of Manju is that you can't talk about free action when you're subjected to bloody and tyrannic actions, and when a state says that it defines itself to be independent, when it administrates the state and its resources, and it is defending foreign interests. Oftentimes we see that the state or government is the main obstacle in the path to self-determination of the people themselves. But maybe one of the most common comments in relation to the People's Tribunal is in relation to its impartiality. When Rosen himself questioned the impartiality of international tribunals who had the back of the majority of the states, as we saw the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals. They went before what he called the real politics or policy, or the correlation of forces of the states of the time. However, these tribunals weren't capable of convicting the responsible parties of using the atomic bomb. So Bertrand Rosa responded. He said that the feeling of the small victim in the face of a large and cruel victimizer affects us deeply. And this is part of our mythology, of our religion, and our literature. And so our concern for the weak party that fights and that suffers in the face of the larger, stronger power, working to defend their rights, this is the source of our ethics, and it reflects the biggest and most important moments of our history. And then Rosen mentions the biblical scene when we see David and Goliath, and the victims of the Greek and Mongolic periods, coming to the point of the humble guerrillas in Vietnam in the face of the US military powers. And so they said, who can compare the 100,000 tons of Nepal and a peasant who only has a small rifle. And they says the tribunal must inaugurate a new morality from the West, where cold-blooded killing is automatically convicted. It should inspire a new understanding where the hero is the oppressed and the detestable are the arrogant powers that are bleeding out the people for generations. These are issues that are as old as humanity. And so a tribunal like ours, as Rosa said, will be necessary until the last human's needs are satiated, until they open up a path towards life that ends the exploitation of many in the hands of few, where there are human beings who continue, while there are human beings who continue fighting against injustice, we need to continue to be their voice. We must reject the opinion that only people who are indifferent are impartial. We need to change this degraded concept under which there's a confusion between open minds and empty minds. I'm convinced that there's no more a greater tribute to the people of Vietnam, than to say the truth, to tell the truth based on an in-depth and rigorous investigation. We also see that Salvador Senese, who was also a president of the People's Permanent Tribunal, who died recently, and he wrote, "We are sure that a good judge should be impartial, that's not indifferent in relation to the values and the path forward. The process usually is used to confirm with more strength the dignity and the values that have been violated, to tie them to the memory of the incidents with principles, to formalize an action of conviction that's based on the community in relation to the actions that damage the well-being, where the judge is taking a position, and that is based on values." In the end, Francois Rigaud, who was the first president of the People's Tribunal for almost 20 years, and also was a consultant and ad hoc judge for the International Justice Court, and who wrote many books on international humanitarian law, and professor of international humanitarian law in Belgium. He talked about the false fundaments of legitimacy of the legal order. He said there's always this supposition that its dignity is reduced to the effectiveness of a coercive power that's exercised by state apparatus, which is called rule of law in this formal state. And so that was able to legitimize, hence, the Nazi state, and it was able to legitimize as legal the dimensions and method of using the gas chambers to destroy an entire people. Rigaud questioned the legitimacy of international law while still being tied to the theory of identification of rights and state. And it hasn't been possible to justify the legal quality of a non-territorial system, such as the legal status of the United Nations, which is lacking state security forces or obligatory jurisdiction. So we also see the example of Israel, which has mocked all of the different resolutions from the General Assembly of the United Nations for about 60 years. These are ineffective convictions or rulings in relation to the cases of apartheid or foreign occupation. Rigaud says that the right of the people needs to be supported by the people themselves. Everyone who struggles, who suffers, who sacrifices themselves to improve the well-being of their people, they are the only people who are the true guarantors of legitimacy of a tribunal. And so he also shares a pathetic example that says that the Duvalier dictatorship in Haiti and the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, they were convicted after the fact by numerous governments and the mass media, only when they'd already been taken down by the people themselves. However, beforehand, the Russell Tribunal and the People's Permanent Tribunal had already convicted them when they were still recognized and respected around the world by the majority of the countries. So the legitimacy of a legal system, as Rigo says, this is the future and not the past, as is understood by the archaic conception of a sacralized power. Rigo adds that in no place the poor people have allowed themselves to be sacrificed by the wealthy, and understanding them as the people, they are the heart of that concept themselves. The right of the people tends to restore the dignity of those who, due to the correlation of forces, have been pushed out of power and have had their goods and well-being taken away. So I'd like to conclude with this reflection. This People's Permanent Tribunal concludes its third intervention in Colombia, showing the genocidal characteristics of the state history. And it does so in a moment when the Colombian people are mobilized. They have risen up against the manifestations of this genocide. There are barricades and there are ports of resistance which are multiplying themselves across the country. And maybe for the first time, there's a questioning of the economic, political, military, and cultural structures which have been protected for centuries, which have protected and covered up the genocidal practices. So this ruling is delivered to a people that is awake and is looking for paths towards its emancipation from oppression. And repeating the words of Francois Rigo, the first president of the People's Permanent Tribunal, we must say that these people with huge and justified manifestations is the only guarantor of the tribunal's legitimacy. Thank you. Thank you so much, Father. As he says, so the people are the only guarantors of the legitimacy of this ruling. And these people are the only people who will be able to request, to demand the fulfillment of their human rights. And so in this way, we have reached the conclusion of this space to be able to read the ruling from the People's Permanent Tribunal. I'd like to thank all the people who have connected with us this morning. We'd like to also thank the jury and the tribunal's directives, the spokespeople for the different organizations that have presented cases, and all of those individuals who have participated in this invitation via Zoom or through social media outlets. Thank you, all of you, for being with us today. We'd like to remind you that the ruling will be available on our webpage, www.tppcolombia.com. You will also be able to find more information about the session and the previous sessions. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for being with us today.